I didn't abandon him, my sister said on national television. I gave him the hardship that made him extraordinary. I nearly dropped the coffee mug in my hand. 15 years earlier, Kimberly had left her 5-year-old son with me and flown to Europe with a millionaire. No birthday calls, no Christmas visits, no nights beside his bed when fever soaked his pajamas through. I raised Owen through scraped knees, school rejections, braces, science fairs, and all the quiet years when he still looked toward doors a little too quickly. Now, his AI research had helped secure a $20 million grant, and suddenly Kimberly was calling herself his biggest inspiration. Then, she mentioned the little backpack he used to keep packed by the door. My blood went cold. She should never have known about that backpack. But that morning, before my sister rewrote 15 years of our lives for a national audience, the backpack had been sitting across my knees while I tried to repair its broken clasp with a pair of needle-nose pliers. "Hold still," I told Owen. "I am holding still. The bag, not you." "Oh." He slid the faded black backpack across the kitchen table toward me, then immediately reached past it for one of the 3 energy drinks lined up beside his laptop. I slapped his hand away. He stared at me. "You're 45, he said. "You can't just hit people anymore." "I didn't hit you. I prevented a medical emergency." "It's caffeine." "It's your 4th one." "3rd. I looked toward his refrigerator. He sighed. "You counted them?" "I opened your fridge." "That feels invasive. Your refrigerator contains yellow mustard, half a carton of eggs, 3 energy drinks, and a takeout container that may have developed voting rights." He leaned back in his chair and rubbed both hands over his face. At 20, Owen had grown into a lanky 6-foot version of the solemn little boy who used to take apart broken clocks just to see whether he could make them tick again. His dark hair was too long because he kept forgetting to schedule a haircut, and there were purple half-moons under his eyes from the last 2 weeks of deadlines. National television had apparently discovered him before basic adult nutrition had. Northbridge Institute of Technology had announced its new auditable AI research initiative at 8 that morning. $20 million over several years, spread across faculty salaries, graduate researchers, computing resources, outside collaborators, and multiple technical projects. Owen was an undergraduate research fellow, not the man who had personally been handed a $20 million check, but the press release highlighted an open-source provenance system he had helped build, and that was enough for the headlines to do what headlines did. 20-year-old researcher behind $20M AI breakthrough. I had already seen 3 versions that made it sound as if he owned a laboratory, a private jet, and possibly the internet. Owen hated every one of them. "You know they're going to ask about the money again," I said. "I know. And you're going to correct them." "I know. And you're going to eat before the press thing." He lowered his hands and looked at me through his fingers. "Do you want to come to the lab and answer the questions for me?" "Yes." That wasn't an invitation. "I know." That got the smallest twitch at the corner of his mouth. I bent over the backpack again. One plastic side of the clasp had cracked almost through. I had told him to replace the whole bag 6 years ago. He had refused. Then I had offered to buy him a better one when he graduated high school. He had refused again. "It still works," he always said. That was Owen. If something still had a use, he did not throw it away. Sometimes that included people. I pushed the thought aside. "So, explain it to me again," I said. "The provenance thing." He groaned. "You sat through my presentation." I sat through 47 slides containing words no American should have to hear before lunch. Most of those words were English. "That is your opinion." He took the backpack from me long enough to pull his laptop closer and rotated the screen. Lines, diagrams, and colored boxes filled it. He began explaining how an AI system could produce an answer that sounded perfectly confident even when the information underneath it came from weak, altered, or unreliable sources. His work, in very simplified terms, tried to preserve a trail. Where did a claim come from? What evidence supported it? Had that evidence changed? Could another person trace the answer back instead of simply trusting the machine because it sounded certain? I listened for perhaps 30 seconds before holding up one hand. So you built an expensive system that asks, "Who told you that?" He stared at me. That is offensively simplified. But correct. His mouth tightened. Basically, I've been doing that for free since 1980. 1. You weren't alive for all of 1981. See? Provenance. He laughed then, a real one, and some of the tension went out of his shoulders. That sound had always done something physical to me. Even now, some part of my body still remembered the years when laughter from Owen had felt like proof that I was not failing him. When Kimberly left in 2011, she said Europe would last a few weeks. She signed a temporary caregiver authorization, left Owen's medical information and enough clothes for a short stay, and flew off with Malcolm Price, a wealthy man who could make escape sound like reinvention. I was 30, working operations at a biomedical nonprofit, and living alone in a 2-bedroom apartment. 3 weeks became 6, then months. Calls became texts. Texts became excuses. Eventually, even the excuses stopped. By 2012, Kimberly had signed written assent from abroad, and I became Owen's court-appointed guardian. I never adopted him. Partly that was practical. Partly I kept believing she might one day understand what she had done, and I never wanted Owen to think I had taken him from her. His father, Evan, had died when Owen was 3, and modest survivor benefits helped while my salary carried the rest. I softened the truth for a child who had already lost one parent. Adults make mistakes that have nothing to do with how lovable you are. That part I still believed. The years filled themselves with ordinary evidence. Waffles cut into squares, braces, a thermostat he dismantled at 9, a competitive coding program at 14 whose acceptance email he reread for days. Then, at 16, he came home after bombing a presentation, dropped his backpack by the couch and said, "Mom, please don't tell me it builds character." At 16, he came home after bombing a presentation he had practiced for 2 weeks, dropped his backpack by the couch and said, "Mom, please don't tell me it builds character." Then he froze. I froze too. Neither of us moved. He had called me Mom. The word seemed to hang between us, like something fragile that would shatter if either of us touched it. Finally, he looked down and said, "Sorry." That hurt worse than anything Kimberly had ever said to me. I reached for his shoulder. "You never have to apologize for what you call someone who stays." He had hugged me then, hard and sudden, his forehead against my shoulder. We never had a ceremony about it, no grand speech. Sometimes I was Laura. Sometimes I was Aunt Laura. More often, over the years, I simply became Mom. That was enough for me. I thought it was enough for everyone. My phone rang on the kitchen counter at 12:43. Mom. I wiped grease from the pliers onto a paper towel and answered. Patricia did not say hello. "Turn on American Daybreak." I glanced at Owen. "Why?" "Just turn it on." There was something in her voice I recognized immediately. The brittle urgency she used when she already knew there was a problem, but wanted someone else to encounter it before she had to explain it. "What happened?" "Laura." That one word told me plenty. Owen had his laptop open again, but his eyes had moved to me. I walked into the living room and turned on the television. American Daybreak was rerunning a segment from earlier in the morning. A familiar blonde host sat in a cream-colored chair beneath studio lights. Beside her sat a woman in a tailored ivory suit, dark hair swept neatly away from her face, one ankle crossed over the other. My stomach dropped so fast it felt like missing a stair in the dark. Kimberly. I had seen photographs over the years. Patricia occasionally showed me holiday cards or charity event pictures, despite my asking her not to. But there was something different about seeing my sister move again. Her smile had not changed. It was the same smile she used as a teenager when Dad caught her sneaking in after midnight. The smile that managed to suggest she was amused by the fact that other people still believed rules applied equally. A graphic appeared beneath her. Kimberly Bennett Price, the mother behind a young A-star. For a second, I genuinely thought I had misread it. Owen came to stand behind the couch. He said nothing. The host leaned toward Kimberly. Your son has become one of the young faces attached to this extraordinary new $20 million AI initiative. You haven't spoken publicly about your family before. What is today like for you? Kimberly pressed her fingers lightly to her chest. I'm incredibly proud. Something cold slid under my ribs, she continued. People see the success now, but they don't always see the choices that come before it. Owen was always different, curious, intense. He needed stability, and at that point in my life, I knew I couldn't give him the quiet environment he needed. The host nodded with an expression of practiced sympathy. So you made the decision to let your sister care for him. Kimberly's eyes softened for the camera. It was the hardest act of love I ever made. My fingers tightened around the coffee mug. Behind me, Owen's breathing changed. Not faster, slower. That was worse. Kimberly talked about being young, about grief after Evan died, about feeling unequipped to give Owen the structure he deserved. Every fact had just enough truth wrapped around it to make the lie difficult to grab. Then she said my name. Laura was in a place where she needed someone too. I think people forget that. She had built this very orderly, very solitary life. Owen needed stability, and Laura needed someone to pour all that love into. In a strange way, they rescued each other. The mug slipped half an inch in my hand. Coffee splashed over my thumb. The pain came a second later. I set it down before I dropped it. Owen moved toward me. Are you burned? I'm fine. I was not fine. My sister had just turned 15 years of court hearings, fevers, school calls, ordinary mornings, and chosen responsibility into a favor she had done me. In Kimberly's version, I had been lonely, Owen had needed somewhere to go, and she had solved both problems by leaving. My phone was still connected to Patricia. Mom, I said, I know how it sounds. How it sounds. She's nervous. She's trying to explain something complicated on television. I looked at the screen, then at Owen. What exactly is complicated about 15 years without a phone call? Patricia went quiet. Laura, please don't do anything while you're angry. There it was the family rule I knew by heart. Kimberly could act. Everyone else had to regulate the consequences. She could leave, rewrite the past on television, and I was still expected to be careful not to make things worse. She's finally telling her side, Patricia said. Owen's head turned slightly. That hurt more than the interview. Her side? I repeated. I'm not saying I agree with every word. Then what are you saying? I'm saying this is already public. Think about Owen. I almost laughed. Think about Owen. I had been doing that since George W. Bush was still on old newspapers in the recycling bin. Before I could answer, Owen reached for my phone. I gave it to him. Grandma, he said. His voice was calm enough to frighten me. Patricia immediately softened. Sweetheart, I'm going to call you later. Owen, I only meant later. He ended the call. Then he handed the phone back to me and sat in the armchair across from the television. His elbows rested on his knees. His hands hung between them. He had sat exactly like that when he was 8, and another kid at school asked why his real mother did not want him. Small body, small hands. Trying not to take up emotional space. I crossed the room and shut off the television. No, he said. I looked at him. Turn it back on. You don't need to listen to this. I do. You really don't. His eyes lifted to mine. Mom. One word. A boundary and a plea at the same time. I turned it back on. Kimberly was talking about resilience. Of course she was. She spoke about how children sometimes became extraordinary not because every hardship was removed, but because they learned to build something from it. Then the host asked, "Would you consider yourself one of Owen's inspirations?" Kimberly smiled. "I have always been his biggest inspiration." My skin went cold. She continued before the host could respond. "Not always in the traditional sense. Sometimes love means knowing when to step back. I think if I had rushed in every time he struggled, every time life hurt, I might have interrupted the very independence that makes him who he is today." Something inside me shifted. Until that moment, a stubborn part of me had still been trying to find embarrassment in her words. Maybe she was panicking. Maybe a publicist had coached her badly. Maybe she was trying to explain an unforgivable decision without admitting what it had really been. But this was different. Kimberly was not defending herself from abandonment. She was claiming abandonment as an achievement. She had taken the wound and signed her name across it. I grabbed my phone. Owen stood. "What are you doing?" "Calling the network." "No. She does not get to say that." I said no. I stared at him. His jaw was tight, but his voice remained level. "This is my life." "I know." "Then let me decide what happens next. I'm trying to protect you." "I know." The words stopped me because there was no accusation in them. That was the problem. He knew exactly what I was doing because I had done it his whole life. I had answered teachers for him, when he was too ashamed to say he had not slept. I had explained Kimberly's absence when he was too young to understand it. I had turned hard truths into softer shapes and told myself that was love. Now he was 20. He did not need me to stand in front of him. He needed me to stand beside him. I lowered the phone. "What do you want?" "One interview." I felt my stomach knot again. "Owen. 1. I give facts. I correct the grant thing. I say who raised me. Then I'm done. You don't owe anyone an explanation." "No." He looked back at Kimberly's frozen smile on the television. "But I owe myself one." The interview happened the next morning. I sat off camera in a small Northbridge media room, while Owen faced a reporter beneath lights he clearly hated. His faculty supervisor had made sure the university communications team reviewed the boundaries beforehand. No discussion of confidential grant details. No family documents. No speculation. Only facts. The reporter asked whether Owen had received $20 million. "No," he said. "Northbridge and its research partners received a multi-year grant. I'm an undergraduate researcher on one part of the work." Then she asked about Kimberly. He paused. I watched his thumb rub once across the side of his index finger, an old nervous habit. "My biological mother left me in my Aunt Laura's care when I was 5. Laura later became my legal guardian. My mother did not raise me. She did not attend my school events. She did not come to my graduation. We did not have a parent-child relationship." The reporter leaned forward. "Do you consider Laura your mother?" Owen looked toward me, only for a second. "Yes." My throat closed. He turned back to the reporter. "She's the person who stayed." That was all he gave them. By lunch the clip was everywhere, praised by some, attacked by others, and converted into teams by strangers who knew none of us. Owen and I both pretended not to read the comments. At 4 that afternoon, American Daybreak announced Kimberly would respond. I expected anger. I expected tears. I even expected denial. What I did not expect was how comfortable she looked. She smiled gently when the host described Owen's account. She said she respected his lived experience. She said children could understand adult decisions differently. Then she began telling stories. Tiny stories. His fascination with taking things apart. The way he hated peas. A science fair project. I felt increasingly uneasy. Some of those things could have come from old family conversations. Patricia had stayed in occasional contact with Kimberly despite my objections. I knew that much. Then Kimberly laughed softly. He was always preparing for the next thing. Even when he was 5, he kept this little backpack packed beside the front door. That was Owen, always ready for the next chapter. The room disappeared. Not literally, but sound thinned. The edges of the television blurred. My hands went numb. I could smell the old apartment suddenly, though 15 years separated me from it. Laundry detergent, toast, the dusty radiator that clicked all night, a little black backpack beside my front door, pajamas folded badly inside, 2 toy cars, a snack pack of crackers, 5-year-old Owen sitting on the floor tying and untying one shoelace. I had asked him why the bag was packed. He had looked up at me as if the answer were obvious. So Mom doesn't have to wait when she comes back. I had gone into the bathroom afterward, locked the door, and pressed a towel over my mouth so he would not hear me cry. That backpack had never meant ambition. It meant waiting. It meant a 5-year-old boy making himself easy to collect. And only 3 people had known why it stayed beside that door. Me, Owen, and my mother. On the television, Kimberly was still smiling. Beside me, Owen had gone completely still. Slowly, he turned his head toward me. I looked at him. Neither of us had to say a word. My sister had known about the backpack, which meant she had known far more than either of us had ever imagined. For several seconds after Kimberly mentioned the backpack, neither Owen nor I moved. The television kept talking while we stared at the private memory she had somehow carried onto a national set. For 15 years I had understood her absence as cruel but simple. She left and failed to call. The backpack changed that. She had known something she should never have known. I picked up my phone. Owen watched me. "You're calling her?" "Grandma." He nodded once. I called Patricia twice. The second call went straight to voicemail, and the mechanical greeting made my palms sweat. She had been urgent enough to make sure we watched Kimberly on television. Now she was unavailable. "I'm going over there," I said. "I'm going over there. I'll come." "No." His head lifted. I forced myself to slow down. "I need to ask her one question, and I need to hear the answer without worrying about what it's doing to you. I'm not 5. I know." "Then don't do that." The words landed cleanly. "Don't decide what I can handle because you're afraid I'll break." I pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of my nose. "You're right." He waited. I looked at him. "Do you want to come?" His gaze shifted toward the dead television screen. After a moment, he shook his head. "No." "All right. But call me after." "I will. And don't let Grandma talk you into apologizing." Despite everything, the corner of my mouth twitched. "I don't apologize that easily." He gave me a look. We both knew that was a lie. 35 minutes later, I was standing on my parents' front porch, with my heart beating hard enough to make my blouse move against my ribs. My mother's house had always smelled the same. Lemon furniture polish, coffee, and whatever candle Patricia had decided made a room feel finished. That afternoon, it was cinnamon. She opened the door before I knocked a second time. Her eyes went immediately to my face. "Laura, did you tell Kimberly about the backpack?" "No, hello. No soft entry." Patricia's fingers tightened around the edge of the door. "What?" "You heard me. Come inside. Answer me." A car passed on the street behind me. For one stupid second, I watched it move through the reflection in the storm door, and an image of 5-year-old Owen turning his head toward every slowing engine hit me so hard my stomach clenched. Patricia stepped back. "Please." I went inside. Dad's truck was gone. I was grateful. Thomas loved us, but he had spent most of his adult life believing that if he waited long enough, the women in his family would eventually stop fighting without requiring him to choose a side. Patricia led me to the kitchen. A mug beside the sink and a grocery list on the counter looked obscenely ordinary. She sat. I remained standing. Did you keep Kimberly informed about Owen? Patricia's eyes dropped to the tabletop. Not yes, not no. My skin prickled. Mom. She was his mother. There it was. I pulled out the chair opposite her and sat because my knees had started to feel unreliable. That isn't an answer. She had a right to know he was safe. She had his phone number. She knew you were angry. I was his guardian. I never blocked her. You made it very clear what you thought of her. I made it clear that leaving a 5-year-old for months and then years was not acceptable. Patricia's mouth tightened. Everything sounds simple when you say it like that. The sentence was familiar. Kimberly's actions were always complicated. Mine were always judgments. I leaned forward. After the guardianship order, she knew where we lived. She had my number, she had yours, she had Dad's. When Owen got old enough, she could have written to him. She could have asked the court about contact if I were supposedly keeping her away. She could have sent a birthday card. Patricia looked toward the window. Children can be confused by people coming in and out of their lives. I stared at her. Are you telling me Kimberly stayed away for Owen's emotional stability? No. I'm saying there were reasons. Whose reasons? Patricia rubbed her thumb over a water ring on the table. I knew that gesture too. She did it when she was trying to find a sentence that would keep everyone from getting angry at the same time. I didn't want him to grow up and someday ask why nobody helped his mother stay connected. The words softened something in me for half a second. Then they made it worse. So you helped her stay connected. I kept her informed. How informed? Patricia's jaw shifted. Mom. Photos sometimes, school things. How often? I don't know. Birthdays? She said nothing. Science fairs? Nothing. Graduation? Her silence answered. I sat back. My fingertips had turned cold, even though the kitchen was warm. Did you tell her he called me Mom? Patricia looked up too quickly. There it was. A yes without a word. I felt my pulse in the back of my neck. That was not yours to give her. She was his biological mother, and I was the person sitting on the floor with him afterward because he thought calling me Mom meant he had betrayed someone who hadn't spoken to him in years. Patricia flinched. I almost stopped. That was my disease. See pain. Reduce pressure. Fix the room. I forced myself not to. How much did she know? Patricia's voice dropped. I never gave her anything that would hurt him. You gave her the backpack. I must have mentioned it years ago. Why? I don't remember every conversation from 15 years ago. It wasn't a cute story. I know that. Do you? Her eyes flashed then, and for the first time I saw anger push through the guilt. You think you're the only person who loved him. I stared at her. I have never said that. You act like everything was yours to carry and everyone else failed. Because I carried it. You always needed to be the responsible one, Laura. The sentence hit me so cleanly I stopped breathing. Patricia kept going. Not cruelly, which somehow made it crueler. Even when you were girls, Kimberly made mistakes and you stepped in before anyone could ask you. Sometimes I think you don't know who you are unless someone needs fixing. I felt the muscles in my back lock. I had never regretted raising Owen, but there had been jobs, relationships, and trips I passed on because someone had to be home by 3:30. I had made those choices willingly. Now, my mother was taking the same road Kimberly had taken on television. Laura needed him too. You wanted to be responsible. As if need erased sacrifice. As if love became selfish the moment it gave the giver a sense of purpose. I stood. Patricia's face changed. Laura, I asked one question. I answered you. No, you defended her title. She is his mother. The old phrase. Still, after everything. I picked up my purse. Biology explained why she should have cared. It never explained why the rest of us had to pretend she did. Patricia looked stricken. I walked out before I could soften it. On the drive back, my hands shook badly enough that I pulled into a grocery store parking lot. What unsettled me most was that Patricia believed her own defense. She had built a moral language in which Kimberly could remain his mother, without doing what motherhood required. I had helped in a different way by softening Kimberly's absence for Owen when he was young. Good intentions did not change the fact that adults had been editing the truth around him for years. My phone buzzed. Owen, you alive? I stared at the message for a second before typing back. Barely. Your grandmother still believes DNA comes with diplomatic immunity. 3 dots appeared. Then, that sounds legally questionable. I laughed once, unexpectedly, and the laugh broke into something dangerously close to a sob. I called him instead. He answered immediately. Well? She sent updates. How many? She wouldn't say. He was quiet. I told him what Patricia had admitted. Photos, school information, graduation. The fact that he had called me mom. I did not tell him what she had said about my needing to be responsible. That wound belonged to me. What do you want to do? He asked. The question caught me off guard. For 15 years, I had been the one asking him, that only after I had narrowed the choices into something safe. I don't know. That's new. Don't get used to it. His breath moved softly through the phone. Then he said, I don't want to talk to her yet. You don't have to. I mean Kimberly. I know. And Grandma either. Okay. I need a couple days. You get as many as you need. After we hung up, I sat in the parking lot until my hands stopped shaking. 2 days later, Patricia called because her aging desktop was out of space. The mail program showed years of duplicated photo attachments, and she explicitly asked me to find them and move the family pictures she wanted to keep onto an external drive. I nearly told her to call someone else. Then I heard the word attachments and understood there might be a lawful, ordinary way to learn how much she had actually sent Kimberly. Don't touch anything until I get there, I said. Her old desktop sat in the downstairs study. I confirmed again that she wanted me to use the attachment index to locate duplicate photographs, then opened only that index. Rows of file names, dates, and subject lines populated the screen. At first they were ordinary Christmas, Dad's birthday, garden pictures. Then I saw, he asked about you again. Below it, first science fair. He stopped sleeping with the hall light on. He's calling Laura Mom now. Graduation photos. He got the scholarship. He doesn't ask anymore. I took my hand off the mouse. I had opened no message and forwarded nothing, but the subject lines alone destroyed photos sometimes. This was a parallel record of Owen growing up. When I called Patricia into the room, the color left her face. She objected that the emails were private. I reminded her that I had only used the attachment index she had authorized and told her I would not open the messages myself. If she wanted me to understand what Kimberly knew, she would have to open them. After a long silence, Patricia sat down and reached for the mouse. The earliest thread attached to an Owen photo was dated 11 days before Kimberly left for Europe, before the tearful goodbye, the promise of a few weeks, and the folder of medical information she had called just in case. The subject line read, Practical things for Owen. Patricia opened it. The first message was from Kimberly. Mom, what pediatrician does Laura use? I know hers is somewhere near Watertown. Also, do you know if her lease allows a child long-term? If this goes past a few weeks, I don't want landlord drama. My vision blurred. I blinked hard. Patricia scrolled. Another message. What elementary school would he end up in from her address? And can she sign school? Doctor stuff temporarily, or do I need to authorize that before we go? I stopped breathing. Before you go, I said. Patricia did not answer. I looked at the date again. 11 days. Kimberly had known. Maybe she had not known exactly how long she would stay away, but she had planned for a few weeks, to become something else before she ever put Owen's bag in my car. Patricia whispered. She said she was just being prepared. I looked at her. Did you believe that? I wanted to. The honesty hurt. She scrolled farther. A reply from Patricia warned Kimberly not to make Laura responsible for a decision Kimberly had not finished making. Kimberly answered, "Laura will never let him fall. She doesn't know how." Something inside my chest seemed to contract around my heart. I saw myself 15 years earlier, with Owen's dinosaur cup in one hand and a permission form in the other. I had thought Kimberly trusted me. She had just not in the way I believed. Patricia moved to close the message. Wait. There was more. Another line. If she thinks he needs her, temporary will turn permanent before she even admits that's what happened. I stood so fast the chair rolled backward and hit the wall. The sound cracked through the room. Patricia flinched. I pressed one hand flat against the desk. I could feel the wood grain under my palm. She chose me. Laura! She chose me because she knew I wouldn't send him away. She knew you loved him. No. My voice came out rough. She knew I would make her leaving safe. Patricia's eyes filled. I looked back at the screen. Suddenly, details I had carried for 15 years shifted into new positions. The binder of medical information, the extra clothes, the signed caregiver authorization, Kimberly insisting that I keep Owen's school documents in case anything comes up. I had interpreted all of it as the frantic organization of a mother leaving temporarily. Now, it looked like an exit plan. Not a perfect written plan, but one built around a single assumption. Laura will handle the consequences. My stomach rolled. I sat again because I was afraid I might be sick. Patricia reached toward my shoulder. I moved away. Her hand stopped in the air. I didn't know she meant to stay gone. You kept emailing her. I thought if I kept Owen real to her, she would come back. I looked at her. That sentence was the first thing she had said that I believed completely. It did not excuse her. It explained the shape of her mistake. Patricia had spent 15 years feeding Kimberly pieces of motherhood in the hope that eventually one of them would make her hungry enough to return. Photos, stories, milestones, pain. Patricia had never understood that Kimberly might learn to live quite comfortably on the pieces. Show me the backpack email. Patricia went still. Mom, I don't remember which one. Yes, you do. Her mouth trembled. She clicked into the archive search and typed one word. Backpack. 3 results appeared. The oldest was from November 2011, a little over 2 months after Kimberly left. Patricia opened it. There was no photo attached, only text. I read my mother's words. Kim. He is still watching the street whenever a car slows down. Laura says he keeps that little backpack next to the front door because he thinks you may come without warning and he doesn't want you waiting while he packs. Please call him, even 5 minutes. He needs to hear your voice. My chest seized. I saw Owen on my old apartment floor. 1 shoelace undone, 2 toy cars in the front pocket. So Mom doesn't have to wait when she comes back. My eyes burned. I turned toward Patricia. You knew. She had both hands over her mouth. I was trying to make her call. You knew what that bag meant. She nodded once. And 15 years later, she sat on television and turned it into a story about how ambitious he was. I never thought she would use it like that. I stared at the screen, at the message, at the plea my mother had sent. Please call him. Even 5 minutes. There was a reply beneath it, collapsed. 1 click away. Open her answer. Patricia did not move. Mom. Her hand rested beside the mouse. I asked her again later. That isn't what I asked. I tried, Laura. Open it. Footsteps sounded in the hall. Dad appeared in the doorway carrying a canvas grocery bag in one hand. He looked from me to Patricia. What happened? Neither of us answered. He put the bag down. Patty? Patricia began to cry. Her shoulders simply folded inward. Dad came closer, saw the screen, and frowned. What is that? I heard my own voice from far away. Mom sent Kimberly updates about Owen for 15 years. Dad stared at Patricia. What? I thought, you told her. Tom, please. How much? She looked at the screen instead of him. Dad's face went slack. That was when I understood he had not known. Maybe he knew Patricia still heard from Kimberly. Maybe even that she shared photographs. But not this archive of a child learning to live around his mother's absence. I pointed at the collapsed reply. Open it. Patricia shook her head. Dad looked between us. Open what? The answer Kimberly sent after Mom told her. Owen was still waiting by the door. Dad's eyes moved to his wife. A long, terrible silence settled over the room. Then Patricia clicked. The reply expanded. One sentence. Don't call him for me. He has to stop waiting eventually. I read it once. Then again. My body went completely still. Not numb. Still. There was a difference. Numbness was absence. This was every nerve in me firing at once so violently that movement became impossible. Dad leaned closer to the screen. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. Patricia covered her face. And in the middle of that quiet room, 15 years of my sister's absence changed shape. Kimberly had not forgotten Owen. She had known he was waiting. And she had decided the kindest thing she could do was stand far enough away to watch him learn how to stop. For a long time after Patricia opened Kimberly's reply, nobody in the study spoke. Don't call him for me. He has to stop waiting eventually. I wanted to call my sister so badly that my hand was already around my phone before I understood what I was doing. Then I saw the 5-year-old in my memory, 2 toy cars in his backpack, and put the phone down. I'm doing nothing tonight, I said. For a woman who had spent most of her life fixing whatever broke first, the sentence felt almost unnatural. But any move I made in anger would warn Kimberly before I understood what I was looking at. I reached past Patricia and closed the email window. She looked startled. That's it? No. My voice sounded calmer than I felt. That's enough for tonight. Dad stared at Patricia. How long? She looked at him. How long have you been sending her things? Patricia swallowed. Years. That's not an answer. Tom. How many years? Her eyes slid toward me. I could see the old reflex forming. Soften it. Contextualize it. Explain how no one meant harm. I stopped her. Dad, not now. His head snapped toward me. You just found out your mother hid 15 years of correspondence from both of us. I know. And Kimberly knew that boy was waiting. I know. My voice cracked on the second word. I hated that. I hated giving the room any evidence of how much it hurt. I stood and reached for my coat. Patricia rose too. Laura, please don't leave like this. I laughed once, but there was nothing funny in it. How would you like me to leave? I just mean we need to talk. We do, but not while I'm trying not to say something I can't take back. Dad muttered. Maybe somebody should. I turned to him. For years, I had wanted him to say exactly that. To stop smoothing the edges and finally choose a side. Now it only made me tired. Dad. He looked down. I faced Patricia again. I'm not asking you to delete anything. Don't forward anything. Don't clean up the archive. Because you're scared of what it looks like. Her cheeks flushed. I would never... You told me 2 days ago you only sent photos sometimes. She closed her mouth. Leave it alone. Laura, those are my private emails. Yes, they are. And I'm not taking them. That mattered. Even through the anger, some practical part of me understood that stumbling across an email while doing something my mother had asked me to do was not the same as owning it. If the truth was ever going to matter outside that room, I wanted it clean. I saw what you showed me, I said. That's all. Patricia's lower lip trembled. You think I betrayed you? I looked at her. No, I think you betrayed him. The air went out of her face. I hated how much it hurt to say it, but I said it anyway. Then I left. Owen was awake when I got home. I knew because his shoes were by my back door before I turned on the kitchen light. He had driven to my place, instead of waiting in Cambridge. He sat at the table with a glass of water between his hands. His backpack was on the chair beside him, not the childhood version, as it had looked 15 years ago. The same bag, older now, frayed, repaired, ordinary. Seeing it made my chest tighten. He looked up. Well? I put my purse down. Grandma showed me the email. His fingers went still around the glass. I sat across from him. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I said, "She told Kimberly you were still waiting by the door." He looked at the table. And? I did not want to tell him. Every protective instinct I had screamed to soften it. Kimberly was overwhelmed. She didn't know what to say. Maybe she thought calling would make it harder. I had spent 15 years translating cruelty into language a child could survive. He was not a child. She told Grandma not to call you for her. His jaw tightened. What exactly did she say? I breathed in. Don't call him for me. He has to stop waiting eventually. Owen did not move. No tears. No curse. No dramatic reaction. His face simply emptied. That frightened me more than anger would have. I reached across the table but stopped before touching him. Do you want me to? No. I waited. He rubbed one thumb along the side of the glass. Then he asked, how old was I? 5. He nodded. I watched him calculate something that had nothing to do with numbers. She knew. Yes. All this time, when I thought maybe she didn't know where we were. Or maybe Grandma stopped telling her things. Or maybe she thought I didn't care anymore. She knew. His throat moved. I could almost see the old excuses collapsing one by one. Finally, he looked at me. Did Grandma keep doing it? Yes. How much? I don't know. I saw subject lines, school things, science fair, graduation. When you started calling me Mom. His eyes closed. That was the first visible wound. I leaned back and let him have the space. After a while, he said, I don't want you calling Kimberly. I wasn't planning to. He opened his eyes. That surprised him. Really? 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 Who are you and what have you done with my mother? Despite everything, I almost smiled. I'm trying something new. What? Not fixing the disaster before I understand it. He let out a breath that could have been a laugh. Then his expression changed again. If you keep looking into this, I need one thing. Anything. No. The firmness in his voice stopped me. Don't say anything. I folded my hands. What do you need? This is my story too. It's more yours than mine. So don't use me to hurt her. My stomach tightened. I wouldn't. You might, if you get angry enough. The answer was so honest it took me a moment. He was right. If I had walked into that study alone and found those emails without thinking about him, I might already have photographed every screen and sent them to the first reporter who called. Not because I wanted fame. Because I wanted Kimberly to hurt in public the way Owen had hurt in private. That distinction would not have made it right. I nodded. I won't publish anything about your childhood without asking you. And if Grandma gives you more? I tell you what affects you. He considered that. Okay. I waited. And you? What about me? If you find things about yourself? A bitter little smile pulled at my mouth. Apparently I'm 45. I get to ruin my own life. That got a real laugh out of him. Small, brief, but real. Then he reached for his backpack. I'm going home. You can stay. I know. You ate? He gave me a look. That means no. Mom, I'm just establishing facts. He stood, then hesitated. Write it down. What? What you know. What you think. Keep them separate. I stared at him. He shrugged. That's literally what provenance is. After he left, I opened a yellow legal pad and divided the page in two. Under what I know, I wrote that Kimberly had planned for care to last, received years of updates, knew Owen had waited for her, knew when he started calling me Mom, and had used the backpack story on television. Under what I think, I wrote that Patricia had given her a private version of motherhood, and that Kimberly had returned because Owen was successful. I crossed out the last line. It was plausible, not proven. For once, I wanted the difference to matter. The next morning, the first formal pressure arrived. The email came from a woman named Celeste Morgan, Communications Director for North Star Futures Foundation. Subject: Family Clarification, Draft for Review. I opened the attachment at my desk before work. By the second paragraph, my shoulders were up around my ears. The document described Kimberly's departure as a mutually understood temporary family placement during a period of personal transition. It said she had remained emotionally invested and strategically supportive from afar. It described me as Owen's primary caregiver during his formative years, and thanked me for providing the stability that allowed Kimberly's long-term vision for his independence to flourish. Long-term vision. I read that phrase 3 times. Then I scrolled farther. North Star wanted permission to use selected childhood photographs in a campaign about youth resilience and innovation. There was language authorizing the foundation to reference Owen's story in donor materials, public programming, digital content, and a proposed collaboration with Northbridge. At the bottom was a signature line for me. Laura Bennett, former legal guardian, maternal aunt. The signature line reduced me to former legal guardian, maternal aunt. After 15 years, North Star wanted the authority of my name without the reality of what the role had been. My phone rang before I finished reading. Kimberly. I stared at her name until the screen almost went dark. Then I answered. Laura. Her voice was warm. That irritated me more than anger would have. You got the draft? I'm looking at it. Good. Celeste worked very hard to keep it balanced. Balanced. The word slid across my nerves. Balanced between what? What happened and how it's being perceived? What happened is usually a pretty good place to start. She sighed lightly. You always do this. I gripped the phone. Do what? Reduce everything to a moral accounting sheet. I almost laughed. You went on national television and claimed you inspired a child you did not call. I did inspire him. There was no hesitation. That chilled me. Kimberly, you think inspiration only counts if someone packs lunches? My hand tightened around the edge of my desk. This isn't a philosophical discussion. No, it's damage control. Then she reminded me that Northbridge did not need a family scandal attached to a major grant. The message underneath the polished concern was obvious. If I refused, I could be made to look dangerous to Owen's work. You want me to sign something that says you stayed strategically involved? I did. How? When I asked what strategically supportive meant, Kimberly paused. We'll get to that, I asked again. She told me there were things I did not know, then added that I had always been the practical one, and that was why she had trusted me with Owen. The echo of her old email, Laura will never let him fall, turned my stomach. When I asked what happened if I refused to sign, she said she was only asking me to think about Owen. Every selfish choice in our family eventually arrived, dressed as concern for him. I looked through the window of my office at a technician pushing a cart down the hall. I'll review it. Delay unsettled her more than an argument would have. I told her I would review the document and ended the call. 10 minutes later, Patricia texted that I should not decide anything while angry, because it could affect Owen's work. I turned the phone face down. At lunch, I showed Owen the draft. We sat at a small cafe near Northbridge, where nobody recognized him because he had put on a baseball cap and looked, for once, like every other exhausted 20-year-old in Cambridge. He read silently. When he reached strategically supportive, one eyebrow lifted. That's new. What? I didn't know Neglect had a branding department. I pressed my lips together. He scrolled. Then his face hardened. Why do they need your signature? Photos. Family history. They want legitimacy. They don't have mine. I know. Then no. Wait. His eyes snapped up. I'm not signing it. I know. Then what are we waiting for? I took a breath. For her to explain what strategically supportive means. He studied me. You think there's something behind that? I think Kimberly does. His fingers tightened around the paper. That doesn't mean there is. No. I thought of the subject lines in Patricia's archive. But if she's bluffing, I want to know what she thinks the bluff is made of. Owen sat back. A server set our food down. He stared at his sandwich without touching it. Don't let this turn into you proving you were a better mother. The words landed harder than he meant them to. I looked at him. He saw it immediately. That came out wrong. No. I folded my napkin once. You're right. I mean, I know what you mean. He looked miserable. I reached across the table and tapped the back of his hand. I don't need a trophy. I know. I need her to stop using your life as evidence for something she didn't do. I know. He looked down. Then he said softly, and I need to know what she did do. That was the real problem. We were no longer investigating an empty space. We were investigating a presence we had never seen. 2 hours after I returned to work, an email arrived from Denise Carver, a former North Star Ethics and Compliance Director who now consulted independently. She said a former colleague had asked her opinion about language circulating in professional nonprofit channels. She recognized the structure of the campaign being built around Owen and offered to explain what North Star would need to substantiate before using those claims institutionally. I showed the message to Owen. His first question was whether we could verify her. We could. Her employment history, published work on youth consent in prior university, partnership consulting all checked out. I called her from my office conference room at 6:15. Her voice was lower than I expected. Laura? Yes. Thank you for calling. Denise told me she had left North Star after repeated disagreements over how vulnerable young people's stories were used. She did not claim a secret scandal. What concerned her was the phrase strategically supportive. Public relations could survive on ambiguity. A formal partnership or fundraising claim should be able to identify what support occurred, when, by whom, and under what authority. People rarely build durable institutional stories from nothing, she said. They use fragments. One introduction becomes years of guidance. One photograph becomes evidence of a relationship. The backpack was exactly that, a real object carrying a false meaning. Then don't argue over adjectives. What should I do? Ask for provenance. The word made me think of Owen explaining his research at the kitchen table. Who told you that? Denise said, if they say she supported him, ask how. If they say she mentored him, ask when. If they use a photo, ask who owns it. If they describe a family arrangement, ask what document supports it. Don't call anyone a liar. Make them define the claim. My shoulders loosened for the first time all day. You sound like Owen. I'll take that as a compliment. He's 20. I withdraw the compliment. I laughed. A small one. Denise's tone softened. I know someone in Northbridge's Partnership Council network from previous work on youth data and consent standards. I can point you toward the right process if this becomes an institutional issue. But you should understand something first. What? If Kimberly has lawyers, that's not necessarily bad news. I leaned back in the chair. That might be the first time anyone has said that sentence. Lawyers are excellent at making confident people put things in writing. I smiled despite myself. Then Denise's voice changed. The humor disappeared. Laura, there's one mistake I don't want you to make. I waited. Do not go into this assuming your sister did nothing. My fingers stopped moving over the legal pad. Denise continued. If she's willing to push a formal campaign this hard, she may have records. Real ones. She may have helped in ways you and Owen never knew. My stomach tightened. That doesn't make her his mother. I didn't say it did. Then what are you warning me about? About certainty. Her answer was immediate. Simple villains are easy. Complicated evidence is not. She warned me not to confuse Kimberly's cruelty with factual emptiness. If my sister was pushing this hard, there might be records of real help we had never seen. Kimberly's abandonment remained true. So did the possibility that, from somewhere outside our view, she had occasionally reached into Owen's life. Not enough to mother him. Enough to leave fingerprints. Denise let the silence sit for a moment. Then she said, very quietly, "You have only scratched the surface of what your sister may be able to prove." Denise's warning followed me home that night. Do not go into this, assuming your sister did nothing. It was an irritating sentence because it refused to sit politely in one corner of my mind. It followed me into the shower. It sat beside me while I brushed my teeth. It was still there at 1 a.m, when I gave up trying to sleep and opened Kimberly's proposed family clarification on my laptop again, strategically supportive from afar. The phrase looked almost elegant on the screen. That was what frightened me. If Kimberly had written, "I secretly raised Owen through telepathy and maternal intuition," I could have laughed. But strategically supportive was soft enough to bend around almost anything. A phone call to the right person. A recommendation passed through someone else. A check I had never known about. One quiet favor. One true fact could carry 10 false implications on its back. I wrote a short list of questions instead of accusations. Who supplied the childhood photographs? Who owned them? What consent allowed North Star to use Owen's story? What specific acts supported, strategically supportive, when those acts occurred? And whether North Star itself had been involved. The next morning I sent the questions to Celeste and copied Kimberly. I mentioned neither Patricia's archive nor the backpack email. Then I went to work. Kimberly called twice within the hour. Celeste replied that North Star was gathering materials. Kimberly texted that I was becoming unnecessarily adversarial. Usually that tone would have sent me scrambling to explain myself. I put the phone face down and kept working. When she later wrote, "You asked for documentation." "We have documentation," I answered. "Great. Please send it." Around noon, Celeste shared a folder of photographs, public clippings, and a memo describing Kimberly's ongoing awareness of Owen's academic development. One science fair photograph stopped me. I had taken it when Owen was 9, seconds before he spilled water across his electrical circuit display. North Star's copy was the same image, cropped and brightened, and it had already appeared in Kimberly's television segment. My jaw tightened. I called Denise. She answered on the second ring. Did she send receipts? She sent a scrapbook. Those can be dangerous. One of the photos is mine. Copyright yours? I took it. Then, you have a clean question. Can I make them take it down? Maybe. Don't assume you have a magic button. News use and foundation promotional use aren't the same, and context matters. Ask the network where they got it, and request removal. Keep it narrow. I looked at the television network's website. The clip was still up. The science fair photograph appeared at the 2-minute mark while Kimberly talked about watching Owen's curiosity develop. I felt heat rise behind my sternum. She watched nothing. Laura, I know. Evidence, not adjectives. I closed my eyes. Right. I sent the network a narrow rights inquiry with my original file and asked that the photograph be removed or replaced while they reviewed its source. By evening, they had swapped it for a generic school exterior. No public apology, no admission, just a small procedural correction. It was the first consequence Kimberly could not talk her way around. That evening, the online version of Kimberly's interview was temporarily edited. The photograph disappeared and was replaced by a generic exterior shot of a school. I called Owen. He answered with, "If this is about food I ate." "It's not." "Then I'm concerned." They removed the science fair picture. There was a pause. "The one with the cardboard volcano?" "It was not a volcano." I was 9. Everything was basically a volcano. It was electrical circuitry. It smoked. "Because you spilled water on it. Science happened." I laughed before I could stop myself. When I told Owen, he made me confirm that I had threatened no one, released none of Patricia's emails, and accused Kimberly of nothing. "I'm impressed," he said, far too seriously. I reminded him that I had standards. He reminded me that I had once called his middle school principal at home. The exchange bought us 30 seconds of ordinary life before he asked what came next. "We ask for more," I said. "I want the difference between what she can prove and what she wants people to assume." My second request narrowed the claims further. North Star confirmed Patricia had supplied the science fair image, but could not yet identify rights for several others. Awareness of academic milestones was not based on direct contact with Owen. Questions about teachers. She treated me like a leak. That was when the atmosphere changed. The first week, Kimberly had treated me like an emotional obstacle. By the second, she started treating me like a leak. Patricia called Thursday night. Her voice was tight. "What exactly did you tell Kimberly about the emails?" "Nothing, Laura. I haven't talked to her about the archive." She called me, asking which messages you saw. I leaned against my kitchen counter. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I didn't know." "Good." "She's furious." "Also good, Laura." I closed my eyes. There it was again. The soft scolding. "Mom." She used a childhood photo I took in a foundation packet. She told a television audience that Owen's backpack represented ambition. Now she wants me to certify that she guided him from afar. If asking her to document those claims makes her furious, that is not my emergency. Patricia exhaled. "I understand why you're angry." "I'm not talking about anger. She thinks Denise Carver is behind this." My grip tightened around the phone. "How does she know about Denise?" "I don't know. She asked if you'd spoken to her." I made a mental note. "Did you answer?" "No." "Thank you. That's not why I called." "Why did you call?" Silence. Then, quietly, she asked whether I still had all the old emails. I straightened. "What did you say?" "That I thought so." "What did she say?" "She said some things could be misunderstood without context." "Of course." My mouth went dry. "Did she ask you to delete anything?" "No." The answer came quickly. I waited. Patricia added, "She told me not to send anything to anyone until she could help me organize it." A cold laugh escaped me. "Organize it." She said there are duplicates and incomplete threads. "Mom, do not touch that archive." "I know." "Do you?" Her voice sharpened. "I am not stupid." "No. But you've spent 15 years believing your job was to make sure Kimberly still had a place in Owen's life. I need to know you're not going to protect her from what her own words mean." Patricia was quiet long enough that I regretted the sentence. Then she said, "I haven't deleted anything." That was not the same as promising she never would. But it was something. Denise called later to say North Star had begun asking her former department whether she had retained documents or violated confidentiality. She had not. She possessed no secret files and was not pretending otherwise. "They're looking for the source of pressure instead of answering the questions," she said. Her instructions stayed the same. "Invent nothing, leak nothing, Keep asking what every organization making those claims should already be able to answer. The missing paperwork was making people nervous without my help. A few days later, that nervousness cost Kimberly her first public prize. She had been scheduled to headline Boston's Future Minds Youth Innovation Summit as the mother who inspired one of America's youngest AI innovators. The title vanished. Then the session itself. Denise explained that Summit Council had asked North Star to substantiate the long-term mentorship language and postponed the appearance when the answers raised more questions. Officially, it was a programming change. Unofficially, paperwork had just told Kimberly no. She called me within an hour. Her voice had lost its polished warmth. "What did you say to the summit?" "Nothing." "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Pretend you don't know what's happening." "I didn't contact the summit." "Denise did." "I don't know." "You expect me to believe that?" "You can believe whatever you want." Her breathing came sharper through the phone. "You are creating problems for people who have nothing to do with our family." "I asked North Star to substantiate language. North Star wants me to sign." "This isn't about a signature anymore." I said nothing. That made her angrier. "You've always been like this." "Like what?" "Self-righteous, when you think you've found the one piece of ground nobody can argue with." I felt my pulse in my wrists. There was a time when that sentence would have made me defend my personality, explain my intentions, offer a softer version of myself. Instead, I asked, "What piece of ground am I standing on?" She went quiet. I continued, "You said you were strategically supportive." I asked how. "You think you know everything because you were physically there." "I didn't say that." "You don't have to." Her voice changed on the last sentence. Not louder, colder. It reminded me of Denise's warning. People rarely build durable lies from nothing. "I'm going to send you more documentation," Kimberly said. "Great." The word escaped before I could stop it. Her pause told me she heard the amusement. "You find this funny?" "No. That was mostly true. I find it interesting." "What?" "That you keep telling me to stop asking questions while promising that the answers will vindicate you. I have nothing to hide." "Then we agree." I ended the call. My hands were shaking. Not from fear exactly. Adrenaline. I set the phone down and pressed my palms flat on the desk until the tremor passed. That night, I met Owen at a diner near Kendall Square. He arrived 11 minutes late and slid into the booth across from me, wearing the same gray hoodie he had worn 3 days earlier. "You own other clothes?" I said. "Unverified." I pushed a menu toward him. He looked at my face. "What happened?" "Your mother lost the Youth Summit keynote." He blinked. "Lost it how?" "Officially, programming changes." "Unofficially?" "They asked North Star to prove the long-term mentor language." He leaned back. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then he slowly lifted his coffee cup. "To bureaucracy." I stared at him. "I never thought I'd say this," he added, "but perhaps paperwork has finally found a socially useful purpose." I laughed, loudly enough that a man in the next booth glanced over. The relief felt almost indecent. Kimberly had not been destroyed. Nothing had been exposed. No one had even publicly embarrassed her. But for the first time since she walked onto national television, something she wanted had failed because somebody asked her to prove what she was saying. Owen's expression softened when my laughter faded. "You look tired." "So do you." "I'm 20. It's fashionable." "I'm 45. It's structural." He took a sip of coffee. "Does this feel good?" The question surprised me. I thought about it. "A little." "Should it?" "I don't know." He nodded. "That's about where I'm at." The waitress brought our food. For several minutes we ate without talking about Kimberly. That mattered more than I expected. We talked about one of Owen's lab partners, who had managed to lock himself out of a server he designed. I complained about a board member at work who used synergy as a verb. Owen accused me of becoming emotionally invested in procurement policy. For 20 minutes, Kimberly was not in the booth with us. Then my phone vibrated. Email. Celeste Morgan. Subject. Additional supporting materials. My appetite disappeared. Owen saw my face. What? She sent more. Now? I nodded. Open it. We're eating. He gave me a look. You were going to open it in the parking lot. He knew me too well. I wiped my hands and opened the attachment list. At first it looked like more of the same. Newspaper clips. Academic pages. A few screenshots of public rankings. Then I saw a PDF labeled Summer Program Trustee Referral 2020. My body tightened. Owen was 14 in 2020. I remembered that summer. He had gotten into one of the most selective coding programs in the region. We had celebrated with supermarket cupcakes because the real bakery was already closed. He had carried the acceptance email on his phone for days and reread it whenever he thought I wasn't looking. He had believed his math teacher's recommendation had made the difference. So had I. I opened the PDF. The first page was an internal note from the program's admissions office. Applicant flagged for secondary review at request of Trustee W. Halpern. I frowned. The trustee's name meant nothing to me. Then I scrolled. Attached beneath it was an email chain from an assistant in Malcolm Price's family office. Mr. Halpern Kimberly Price asked that I make sure this application receives a careful look. No request for preferential admission. She believes the student has unusual potential and may not present conventionally on paper. My skin went cold. Across the table, Owen watched me. What? I turned the phone toward him. He read silently. His fork stopped halfway to his plate. That's my program. I know. His eyes moved back to the email. She asked someone to flag me? It looks like it. Did they admit me because of her? Read the wording. He did. No request for preferential admission. He swallowed. So maybe they just looked twice. Maybe. That still matters. Yes. He sat back. A crease formed between his eyebrows. I kept scrolling. There was a second file. Mentor Introduction, 2023. My chest tightened again. Owen was 17. That was the year he had been introduced to Dr. Samuel Ortiz, an AI researcher who later wrote one of the recommendations that helped Owen enter Northbridge's research ecosystem. I remembered Owen coming home after their first meeting, so excited he spoke for nearly 20 minutes without taking off his coat. He had told me his high school computer science teacher must have passed his name along. The PDF showed something else. Malcolm's office had forwarded one of Owen's public project links to an academic contact. The request was short and careful. Kimberly would appreciate it if someone qualified could take a look at the work. If you think the student merits an introduction to Dr. Ortiz, please make one. No obligation. Below that was the reply. The work is rough, but the kid is unusually good. I'll connect them. I read it twice. Then a third time. My mouth had gone dry. 2 interventions. Not money. Not secret admission. Not fraudulent credentials. Nothing that erased Owen's work. But they were real. I looked at him. His face had become unreadable. Did you know? No. Did Dr. Ortiz ever mention Malcolm? Never. Your teacher? No. I reached for his hand, then stopped. He was staring at the files as if they belonged to somebody else. Finally, he said, "She did something." Yes. The word hurt. Not because I wanted Kimberly to be purely evil, because certainty had been easier. Owen picked up his phone and opened the same files on his own screen. 2 things, he said. Yes. 14 and 17. Yes. No calls? No. No birthday cards. No. No graduation. No. But this. I watched his throat move. This. He leaned back and looked toward the diner window. Outside, people moved along the sidewalk under the blue-white glow of storefronts. A bicycle courier stopped at the light. A woman pushed a stroller. Life continued with insulting normality. Owen's voice dropped. I thought I got that coding program because Mr. Dwyer recommended me. He did recommend you. But she got someone to look again. Yes. And Ortiz. You still did the work that impressed the person who made the introduction. That's not the same question. I knew. He was not asking whether Kimberly had manufactured his talent. He was asking whether she had touched the path. I looked at the two files. Denise's warning came back with perfect clarity. The best misleading stories are usually factually anchored somewhere. Kimberly had not been secretly raising Owen. She had not been mentoring him for 15 years. But somewhere outside our view, twice, she had reached into his life and moved one piece. Not when he was sick, not when he was crying, not when he waited beside a packed backpack. When opportunity appeared, my stomach turned at the pattern before I fully understood it. She had ignored the child, but she had watched the trajectory. Owen looked back at me. There was no triumph in his face, only confusion. What does this make her? I shook my head. I don't know. For once, it was the only honest answer I had. He looked down at the screen again, and I understood why Kimberly had sounded so confident. She had receipts, just not for the story she was telling. The question was whether she knew the difference. For the next 3 days, Owen barely talked about the two files. That was how I knew they had gotten under his skin. If something made him angry, he argued with it. If something scared him, he researched it. If something embarrassed him, he made a joke so dry you could miss it if you blinked. But when something threatened the story he told himself about who he was, Owen became quiet. He still went to the lab. He still answered messages from his faculty supervisor. He still corrected reporters who kept writing that he had won $20 million, as if Northbridge had handed him a suitcase full of cash and a ceremonial key to artificial intelligence. But every time I saw him, the same question sat behind his eyes. How much did she change? I tried not to answer a question he had not asked me to answer. That was harder than it sounds. My whole life, love had meant getting there first. First with a solution. First with a check. First with the right form. First with a story that would make the bad thing hurt less. With Owen, I had built an entire adulthood around seeing the cliff before he reached it. Now he was 20, and the cliff belonged to him. On Friday morning, Northbridge held a donor and research forum in a glass-walled auditorium overlooking the Charles. The event had been scheduled months before Kimberly's television appearance, but the scandal had changed the temperature around it. There were university donors, researchers, nonprofit representatives, journalists, and enough people in expensive shoes to make me aware of every scuff on mine. North Star Futures had been invited as a prospective public engagement partner. Prospective. That word mattered. Nothing had been signed. Nothing had been approved. Kimberly arrived as though the distinction did not exist. I saw her before she saw me. She came through the lobby with Celeste Morgan and 2 North Star staffers, wearing a dark green suit, and the expression of a woman accustomed to people moving out of her way without being asked. For 1 second, my body reacted before my mind did. My stomach pulled tight. Heat rose up my neck. My fingers curled around the strap of my purse. 15 years vanished with humiliating speed. I was 30 again, standing in my kitchen, while Kimberly told me Europe might be good for her head, and that Owen loved staying with me anyway. Then Owen stepped beside me. You okay? I let go of my purse strap. Fine. That was convincing. I'm conserving my talent for later. He looked toward Kimberly. She had seen us now. Her smile appeared instantly. There are smiles people make because they are happy to see you. Then there are smiles designed to establish that nothing you have done has altered their confidence. Kimberly's belonged to the second category. She crossed the lobby. Owen. He gave her a small nod. Kimberly. When Owen greeted her with Kimberly instead of Mom, her eyes flickered. She touched his forearm. He stepped back before her hand settled. The movement was tiny and unmistakable. I thought your interview was very measured, she said. Thanks. I'm glad you corrected the grant reporting. So am I. I just wish you hadn't felt the need to make our family part of it. Owen looked at her. You made our family part of it the day before. Celeste looked at the floor. I almost admired her survival instinct. Kimberly inhaled through her nose. This isn't the place. No, Owen said. It isn't. Then he walked toward the auditorium. I followed. Behind me, I heard Kimberly say something low to Celeste. I did not turn around. The forum opened with the usual language about collaboration, accountability, and public trust. Owen sat on stage among faculty and graduate researchers, looking exactly what he was. Capable, tired, and 20 years old. The moderator asked each person to describe what auditable AI meant in ordinary language. When it was Owen's turn, he looked out at the room and said, A confident answer isn't the same thing as a trustworthy answer. If a system makes a claim, you should be able to ask where it came from, what evidence supports it, and whether that evidence actually says what the system implies. A few people laughed when he added, My mom calls this an expensive version of, Who told you that? Heads turned toward me. My face went hot. Owen grinned. I mouthed, You're dead. He looked delighted. The moderator moved on. For the first 20 minutes, the event stayed exactly where it belonged. Research, data integrity, public trust, responsible deployment. Then a donor in the second row asked about partnerships. Northbridge's initiative director explained that several outside organizations had expressed interest in supporting education and public outreach, but that no storytelling or youth-facing partnership had been finalized. The moderator looked toward the panel. What standards should govern those relationships? One faculty member talked about conflict, of interest review. Another mentioned data privacy. Then Owen leaned toward his microphone. I knew his face well enough to recognize the moment before he made a decision. My spine straightened. He said, I think the same standard should apply to institutional stories that applies to technical claims. The room quieted. If an organization says it helped produce an outcome, it should be able to show what it actually did. When, how, who was involved, and if the story belongs to a real person, that person should know how it's being used. A pressure began building under my ribs. Owen continued. If a partner wants to say it guided someone, mentored someone, shaped someone, then that should be traceable. Not because every human relationship needs a spreadsheet, but because once a personal story becomes part of fundraising or institutional branding, it stops being just a family story. I did not look back at Kimberly. Owen had accused no one. He had simply stated the standard he used in his own work. The initiative director agreed that future storytelling partners would be expected to substantiate claims about who had done what. In a room full of donors, the rule sounded almost boring. That was its strength. The panel ended 25 minutes later. People rose. Donors clustered around the stage. I had almost reached the lobby when Kimberly appeared beside me. Laura. Her voice was quiet. I kept walking. Not here. Then where? She pointed toward a side corridor beside the auditorium. Every instinct told me not to follow Kimberly into the side corridor. Then I remembered the two verified files, age 14, age 17, and followed because I needed to hear what meaning she assigned to them. The corridor ended near a staff elevator. The noise of the forum softened behind the closed door. Kimberly turned. What exactly are you doing? I folded my arms. Standing in a hallway. Don't. Her voice had changed. No television warmth, no charitable patience. What was that? Owen answering a question. You coached him. No. You expect me to believe he suddenly decided to talk about provenance and family storytelling? He researches provenance. You know what I mean. Yes, I did. She moved closer. You're using his work to attack me. The accusation was so cleanly reversed that for a second I almost admired it. You went on television using his work to rehabilitate yourself. I told the truth. Which truth? Her eyes hardened. The truth that you were not the only person who contributed to who he became. My pulse started climbing. I forced myself not to answer too fast. Then Define contributed. Her mouth tightened. I already sent you documentation. 2 introductions. 2 interventions at crucial developmental points. You called a trustee and routed him toward a mentor. I saw what he needed. You saw him through Mom's emails. I knew my son. No, you knew updates. Kimberly's answer was not shame, but philosophy. She said I had always reduced motherhood to labor lunches, forms, doctors, bedtimes, while she had understood that Owen needed challenge. In her telling, I had provided comfort. She had provided distance. Distance made him self-reliant. Uncertainty made him observant. You're taking credit for hurting him, I said. I'm taking responsibility for the whole outcome. The hallway seemed to narrow. I could hear the faint hum of the elevator behind her. Kimberly's face stayed calm. If I had come back every time he cried for me, what would that have taught him? That his mother came back. That he could make enough noise and somebody would rescue him. My stomach turned. He was 5. And now he's 20 and doing work most people twice his age couldn't understand. I felt my heartbeat in my throat. Kimberly leaned closer. You kept him safe. Her voice dropped. I made him hungry. My hands went numb. For years I had imagined cowardice, grief, selfishness, even the possibility that returning simply became harder with time. I had never imagined that Kimberly regarded the wound itself as useful. She did not think Owen had succeeded despite her absence. She believed part of his success proved the absence had worked. You think the fact that he survived you makes what you did valuable. That's not what I said. It is exactly what you said. Kimberly watched me. You want me to apologize for not being you. I want you to stop calling what you did motherhood. Her face went cold. You don't get to define motherhood for me. No. I surprised both of us. She blinked. I continued. I don't. My voice steadied. And you don't get to define it for Owen. The elevator dinged behind her. Neither of us moved. I'm not signing the family clarification, I said. Her lips parted. I'm not asking Owen to soften what he said. I'm not helping North Star turn 2 introductions into 15 years of guidance. And I'm not releasing Mom's emails to humiliate you. That last part caught her. I saw it. Fear. Tiny, but there. So you did read them. Enough. Her face changed again. You had no right. I'm not using them. Then why mention them? Because I want you to understand something. I stepped closer. For 15 years, I cleaned up whatever you left behind. I explained you. I defended you to a child who thought your absence meant there was something wrong with him. I even kept telling myself there had to be a reason I was too angry to see. My voice shook once. I let it. I'm done doing that. Kimberly folded her arms. So this is revenge? No. You expect me to believe that? I don't care what you believe. That sentence felt like opening a window after years in a locked room. Her eyes narrowed. What happens when North Star produces records you don't like? If they're true, they're true. And if they prove I influenced him, then you get credit for what you actually did. She looked almost triumphant. I finished. Nothing more. The triumph vanished. If you helped him get into a coding program, say that. If you helped connect him to a mentor, say that. But if you want to call that 15 years of motherhood, put the claim in writing and let people examine it. For the first time, Kimberly looked uncertain, not defeated, uncertain. I realized then that she had spent years controlling meaning because nobody had ever forced her to separate an event from the story she wrapped around it. She recovered quickly. You think facts are going to save you? No. I thought of Owen's research. Facts are just where we start. I made it to the restroom before the adrenaline caught up with me. My jaw ached and my hands shook while I ran cold water over my wrists. I made him hungry would not leave my head. When I came out, Owen was waiting near the sinks. I stopped. This is the women's restroom. The hallway outside it is gender neutral. You're standing inside. I was concerned. I looked around. An older woman washing her hands gave us both a look. Owen stepped backward into the hallway. Better? Marginally. I joined him. He studied my face. She talked to you? Yes. What did she say? I wanted to protect Owen from the corridor conversation, but our agreement stopped me. When he asked for all of it, I told him Kimberly believed distance had built his self-reliance, and that the two hidden interventions proved she had shaped his path. Then I gave him the exact sentence. You kept him safe. I made him hungry. Owen stared at the opposite wall. His face did not move. I waited. Finally he asked, She said hungry? Yes. Like that? Yes. His fingers curled inward against his knees. That's insane. Yes. He looked at me. Then, almost angrily, Don't agree that fast. I stopped. He stood and paced 3 steps. I know it's insane. Okay. But what if part of it is true? There it was. The question underneath everything. I stood too. Pain can change people. That's not what I asked. I know. If I hadn't been so obsessed with proving I could do everything myself, Owen, if I hadn't needed every teacher to think I was worth keeping around, if I hadn't treated every rejection like a personal emergency, that doesn't make her right. How do you know? The force in his voice startled both of us. He looked away. I'm sorry. Don't apologize. He rubbed his forehead. I don't know what belongs to what anymore. I moved closer, but did not touch him. You built the work. She opened 2 doors. You walked through them. Would I have gotten there without them? I don't know. He looked at me sharply. I forced myself not to rescue him with a certainty I did not possess. I don't know, I repeated. Maybe you would have. Maybe you wouldn't. That still doesn't make what she did to you a strategy. He swallowed. Then what does it make the 2 things she did? 2 things she did. He laughed once bitterly. That's annoyingly simple. Simple doesn't mean easy. He sat back down. A few minutes later, his faculty supervisor came looking for him, and life forced us to separate before either of us had an answer. That evening, Owen returned to his apartment. I went home. At 7:30, I was standing in my kitchen, cutting an onion, when my phone buzzed. A message from Owen. She sent me something. My knife stopped. What? A dossier. The word made my stomach drop. Before I could call him, a file appeared in our shared message thread. Kimberly, Price Owen Bennett Developmental Timeline. I stared at the title. Then Owen called. I answered immediately. Did you open it? No. Do it. His voice sounded wrong. Flat. I dried my hands and opened the file on my laptop. The first pages contained the 2 interventions we already knew. Coding program, age 14. Mentor introduction, age 17. Then came screenshots from Patricia's updates. Grades, competition results, project links, notes about what Owen was reading, stories about his habits. Kimberly's annotations appeared beside some of them. Strong pattern recognition, needs challenge, too protected socially, would benefit from stronger peer cohort. Look for someone technical, not nurturing. My skin crawled. It did not read like a mother's diary. It read like an evaluation. Page after page built the same argument. Kimberly had watched, assessed, and selectively acted. Not enough to raise him, enough to tell a story. At the end was a short note addressed directly to Owen. You deserve to know that your life was never as simple as Laura made it sound. I did not disappear. I chose not to interfere emotionally, while still making sure the right doors were available when they mattered. You can hate that choice, but you cannot honestly say it had no effect on who you became. I heard Owen breathing through the phone. Mom? I'm here. Keep going. There was one more page, a timeline connecting the coding program to a later competition, the competition to the mentor's attention, the mentor to Northbridge, and Northbridge to Owen's present research role. Arrows, dates, cause and effect. A neat little machine built out of his life. At the bottom, Kimberly had written one sentence. You built the work. I helped build the conditions. I closed my eyes. Mom? I'm still here. Owen was silent for a moment. Then he said, What if she's right? She isn't. You didn't even think. I don't need to think about whether abandoning a 5-year-old was a valid development plan. That's not what I mean. I knew. He kept going. What if the coding program changed everything? What if Ortiz changed everything? What if I only got to Northbridge because those two things happened in that order? You still earned every step after the introduction. But if she moved the first pieces? 2 pieces. 2 pieces can change a system. His voice cracked on the last word. That frightened me more than anything Kimberly had said. I sat down at the kitchen table. Owen, I've spent my whole life thinking the one thing that was mine was what I could do. It is. What if even that started with her? My chest tightened. He breathed in sharply. Then he asked the question Kimberly had designed the dossier to create. If she helped build the road, how much of what I did on it is actually mine? Owen's question from the dossier stayed with me through the night. If Kimberly helped build the road, how much of what he did on it was actually his? I wanted to answer with the certainty mothers are supposed to possess. But after years of sanding down painful truths, I would not give him another beautiful lie. The next morning, Kimberly did what she was best at. She took 2 facts and built a cathedral around them. The first story appeared online before 8. The headline was careful. Absent mother or silent supporter? New records complicate a researcher's family story. By 9, 3 more outlets had versions of it. Nobody accused Owen of lying. That would have been too crude. Instead, the articles raised questions. They described the coding program referral and mentor connection. They quoted unnamed people familiar with the family, who said Kimberly had remained informed for years. They repeated the phrase, strategic support. One columnist wrote that modern families were complicated, and that physical absence did not always mean emotional abandonment. I read that sentence twice. Then I closed the browser before I threw my coffee mug at the wall. At 10:14, Owen called. Northbridge wants me in communications. My stomach tightened. Why? They're pausing the North Star discussion. That's good. Not really. He sounded exhausted. What else? They want everyone to stop doing personal interviews for now. Me, North Star, anybody using the grant in the family story. My fingers went cold. Are they touching your research? No. Your fellowship? No. The grant? No. I breathed again. They're being careful, he said. They don't want the institution's name in whatever this turns into. That's reasonable. I know. The 2 words came out sharp. I stopped. He sighed. Sorry. You don't have to apologize. I'm just tired of everybody saying reasonable things while my life gets put under a microscope. I closed my eyes. What do you need? I don't know. Okay. There was a silence. Then he said, Apparently, the internet thinks you kept me from her. Something hard formed behind my ribs. Don't read comments. You read comments. I'm older. My mistakes have seniority. He almost laughed. Almost. I heard the sound catch and disappear. Before we hung up, he said, "Mom? Yeah? If Northbridge asks, don't tell them more than you have to." "I won't. I mean it. I know." After the call, I sat very still. That was the first time I understood what Kimberly's counterattack had actually accomplished. She had not disproved us. She had made the truth muddy, and muddy truth was often more useful than a clean lie. A clean lie could be broken. Mud got on everyone. By lunchtime, Northbridge's communications office had issued a statement saying the $20 million initiative was based on independent scientific review and that no family member had any role in grant selection or project governance. That should have protected Owen. Instead, people online treated the statement as evidence that something serious must have happened. One man with a podcast and a microphone that looked more expensive than my car announced that the university appears to be distancing itself from the family controversy. Family controversy. As if we were arguing over where to spend Thanksgiving. At work, I tried to focus on a budget variance report. Every 20 minutes, my phone lit up. Reporter. Unknown number. Reporter. Patricia. I ignored all of them until one message appeared from Thomas. "Call me when you can." I went into an empty conference room. Dad answered immediately. "Your mother did something." My hand tightened around the phone. "What?" She gave a statement. I stood up so fast the chair rolled backward. "To who?" "I don't know. Some reporter. Maybe more than one." "What did she say?" Dad swore under his breath. That was unusual enough to scare me. "She said she kept Kimberly informed all these years." I closed my eyes. "What else?" "She said there were always people quietly looking out for Owen." My stomach dropped. "Dad, I know." "No, you don't. I know it makes it sound like Kimberly was involved. It makes it sound like I lied." I told her that. I started pacing. The conference room suddenly felt too small. Why would she do that? She says people are attacking Kimberly like she never cared. I stopped walking. For a second, I had no words. Then I laughed. One dry, cracked sound. "Of course. Laura." "No. Of course she did. She thought she was helping." "She always thinks she's helping." "I know. That stopped me." Dad's voice was different. Not defensive. Tired. "She told me she wanted people to understand it wasn't black and white." I gripped the edge of the table. Was the backpack black and white enough for her? Silence. I immediately wished I had not said it. Not because it was unfair. Because Dad had read the email too. He was hurting in his own way. "I'm sorry," I said. "No." His answer was quiet. "You don't apologize for this one." I closed my eyes. Dad continued. "I told her what she did was wrong." "What did she say?" "That she was trying to keep the family from tearing itself apart." I could picture Patricia saying it. Hands folded, voice trembling. Still, believing peace was something you could manufacture if the person in the most pain agreed to be quiet. Dad said, "I told her keeping a family together isn't the same as keeping its lies comfortable." I did not speak. In 45 years, I had never heard my father say anything like that. "Are you okay?" I asked. "No." It was the most honest answer he could have given. Patricia's short statement was already everywhere. It omitted the backpack, the plea for a 5-minute call, and Kimberly's refusal. What remained was love, quiet support, and complicated family. Owen texted before I could react. "Saw Grandma's statement. Don't call her yet." "Intense how plan to?" He answered liar, followed by "Please, Mom." I put the phone away. By late afternoon, the argument online had shifted toward whether I had gatekept Kimberly from her son. Denise sent one instruction: do not respond today. I didn't. At 6, I drove to Owen's apartment. He did not answer the buzzer. I called. Nothing. I used the spare key he had given me, after once locking himself out in January without shoes. The apartment was dark, except for the light over the stove. His laptop sat open on the couch. No Owen. My heart jumped. Owen? No answer. I checked the bedroom. Empty. Bathroom. Empty. Then I saw the balcony door cracked open. He was outside in a hoodie, sitting on the concrete with his back against the wall. The September air had turned cold after sunset. I slid the door wider. You're going to freeze. I'm wearing a sweatshirt. You're in Boston. That is not winter planning. It's not winter. It's emotional winter. He looked at me. Is that a real thing? It is now. I stepped outside and sat beside him. For a while, we said nothing. Below us, traffic moved along the street. A siren rose somewhere toward downtown and faded. Owen held his phone in one hand. The screen was black. You talked to Grandma? I asked. No. Dad did. I know. Did he call you? Yeah. I waited. He rubbed his thumb over the edge of the phone. Then he said, I don't want to go to the lab tomorrow. My stomach tightened. Okay. He looked at me sharply. What? You expected me to tell you to go. Yes. I'm learning. That's unsettling. You're welcome. He looked away again. A few seconds passed. Then he said, what if I step back from the launch? I went very still. The research launch? Just the public part. Is that what you want? I want all of them to stop saying my name. His voice had gone flat. I want to be a person in a room doing work nobody cares about for 1 week. I understood that. What did your supervisor say? That I can take whatever time I need. Then take it. He shook his head. That sounds like quitting. No, it sounds like Tuesday. He did not smile. I studied his profile. His jaw had stubble now. Not much. Enough to remind me how quickly the boy I remembered existed only inside the man beside me. Do you still believe what you asked me last night? I said. What? That your work might not be yours. His shoulders lifted, then dropped. I don't know what I believe. I waited. He spoke slowly. If I hadn't spent my whole childhood trying to be low maintenance, would I have become this obsessive? My throat tightened. He kept looking at the street. If I hadn't needed every teacher to think I was worth keeping around, would I have worked that hard? Owen, I'm serious. I know. If rejection hadn't felt like getting left again, would I have treated every application like a life or death event? I had no answer. He finally looked at me. What if she's right about the mechanism? The question hurt because it was smarter than the one I wanted him to ask. He was not asking whether Kimberly was a good mother. He knew she was not. He was asking whether damage could become fuel. Yes, I said. His face changed. I continued before he could misunderstand. Yes, pain can change you. It can make you work harder. It can make you vigilant. It can make you terrified of needing people. All of that can be true. His eyes dropped. But a scar proving your body healed doesn't mean the knife did you a favor. He looked at me again. I felt my own voice shake. You don't owe the injury gratitude because you survived it well. Neither of us spoke. I had not planned the sentence. Maybe that was why it felt honest. He rested his head back against the brick. After a while, he asked, why did you always tell me she was going through something? The question landed lower than Kimberly's interview had. I stared at my hands. Because you were 5. I wasn't 5 forever. No. By 12, I knew something was wrong. I know. By 16, I definitely knew. I know. He waited. I swallowed. I thought if I told you she was selfish or scared or choosing herself over you, you'd hear that as proof you weren't enough. His face softened, but I kept going. And maybe part of me thought if I left the door open, you wouldn't blame me if she ever walked back through it. His brows pulled together. I would never blame you. You know that now. No, you know that now. The correction hurt. He was right. I looked toward the lights across the street. I spent years protecting you from bitterness. Did it work? I laughed quietly. Apparently not. He almost smiled. Then he said, maybe it protected her too. That one went straight through me. I sat with it. All those softened sentences. All those holidays when I said Kimberly was traveling. All those birthdays when I said international schedules were difficult. I had believed I was protecting a child's heart. But every time I made Kimberly easier to forgive before she had asked for forgiveness, I also reduced the cost of her absence. I think sometimes it did, I said. Owen nodded. The cold had started to sink through my jeans. Come inside. In a minute. You say that about food too. He looked at me. Do you have anything edible? That question is offensive. So no. I stood. Stay here and develop hypothermia. I'm going to buy groceries. He followed me inside. I did not go to the store. I opened his refrigerator. Mustard. Eggs. A piece of cheese wrapped badly in plastic. Bread on the counter. You have the ingredients for grilled cheese. He looked suspicious. Define ingredients. Bread and cheese. The bread is old. You're 20. Your immune system needs hobbies. He sat at the counter while I heated a pan. Grilled cheese had been our emergency food when Owen was small, bad school day, failed test, first heartbreak. I had always burned one side. Apparently trauma had not improved my technique. That night was no different. I flipped the first sandwich and stared at the blackened surface. Owen leaned forward. Perfect. Shut up. If my career collapses, at least your cooking has remained consistently mediocre. I pointed the spatula at him. Consistency is what got you through childhood. He laughed. A real laugh. It startled both of us. For 30 seconds, the apartment became ordinary again. No cameras, Grant, or Kimberly. Just Owen eating the same badly browned sandwich I had made through half his childhood. When he called it consistently mediocre, I told him consistency had gotten him through childhood. His laugh startled both of us in the best way. My phone buzzed. I looked at it. Denise. I almost ignored it. Then a second message arrived. Call me. This matters. The warmth left the room. I called from the kitchen. Denise answered immediately. I got something. My body tightened. From who? I don't know. What do you mean you don't know? It came through a secure whistleblower channel I keep for consulting clients. The sender used credentials that confirm they had internal North Star access, but they stripped identifying information. Owen had stopped eating. I put the call on speaker. What did they send? 2 drafts. An email came through while she spoke. I opened it. The first attachment was a draft North Star ethical storytelling and consent policy, promising accurate attribution, dignity, and adult consent over continued use of personal stories. Kimberly's name appeared as internal sponsor. Denise said North Star planned to make her the public face of stronger ethics in response to the criticism. The irony was almost too clean. I opened the second attachment. North Star, Northbridge Proposed Impact Partnership. A slide appeared. On the right was a photograph of Owen at 17. On the left, case study, resilience cultivated through maternal strategic distance. My stomach turned. Below it, long-term observation of emerging aptitude. Selective intervention at high-leverage developmental moments. Targeted access to advanced peer and mentorship networks. Outcome: exceptional persistence, independence, and innovation capacity. Owen read it once, then again. His face went pale. They turned me into a program. Denise's voice came quietly through the phone. Yes. The partnership deck transformed Patricia's updates into longitudinal awareness, and the two introductions into a repeatable resilience model. Owen pushed his plate away. They're not even lying about the two introductions. They're lying about what those introductions mean. That was the mechanism Kimberly had used from the beginning. A real photograph became motherhood. An update became connection. Two referrals became strategy. She did not need to invent events if she could claim their meaning. Denise, I mean it. These are drafts, internal documents. If you leak them, Kimberly says they were brainstorming and you stole context. Owen looked at me. He knew she was right, Denise continued. The policy is the interesting part. How? If North Star adopts it, they are creating their own standard for consent and accurate attribution. That doesn't automatically make them liable for everything before it. No, but it does create a governance question if they use Owen as the flagship story for the policy rollout while failing the policy's own standards. I stared at the two documents side by side. The idea formed slowly. Not revenge. Structure. What are you saying? I'm saying don't fight her story. Denise's voice sharpened. Let her formalize it. Owen leaned toward the phone. What does that mean? If Kimberly wants North Star to claim it supported or shaped you, make them define every sentence. Make them identify the source. Make them show consent. Make them separate what Kimberly did privately from what North Star did institutionally. I felt my pulse quicken. The room seemed suddenly very clear. Provenance, I said. Exactly. Owen looked at me. Denise continued. She thinks the pile of records proves her version because nobody has forced her to distinguish evidence from interpretation. I looked at the slide again. Maternal strategic distance. Outcome. Exceptional persistence. A polished arrow from abandonment to success. What if she refuses? I asked. Then the partnership stalls. And if she agrees? Denise was silent for one beat. Then she said, then she has to certify what she wants people to believe. Another email appeared. No attachment this time. Just a forwarded line from the anonymous sender. Denise read it aloud. Do not fight her version. Let her certify it. Then ask where every sentence came from. My hands had stopped shaking. For the first time in days, I was not thinking about what Kimberly had done 15 years ago. I was thinking about what she wanted now. A title, a partnership, a public philosophy, institutional credit. And suddenly I understood the weakness hidden inside all of it. Kimberly did not merely want people to forgive her. She wanted the world to officially agree that she had been right. For 3 days after Denise sent me the North Star drafts, I did nothing Kimberly could see. That was harder than any confrontation we had had so far. I went to work. I answered emails. I bought groceries. I called Dad once and deliberately did not ask about Mom. Owen went back to the lab for half days and ignored every reporter who tried to turn his childhood into a debate question. Denise told me twice not to confuse silence with passivity. The leaked documents stayed where they were. We did not forward them. We did not quote them. We did not hint online that we had them. Every instinct in me wanted to grab that phrase. Resilience cultivated through maternal strategic distance and hold it up in front of the world until people understood how sick it was. Instead, I waited. Kimberly called first. I watched her name pulse across my phone while I stood in the parking garage after work. I let it ring out. 30 seconds later, she called again. Then a text. We need to stop this before it damages Owen further. I stared at the words. The old Kimberly would have written, I'm sorry. The current one wrote, before it damages Owen further, as if she had arrived at the fire carrying water rather than matches. I called Denise. She reached out. Good. You say that about things most people consider bad. It's a professional flaw. What do I tell her? There was a pause. The truth. I leaned against my car. That seems unlikely to calm her down. Not all of it. Denise's voice had that dry steadiness I had come to trust. Tell her you're tired. Tell her this is hurting Owen. Tell her you recognize that she can document 2 real interventions. Tell her you don't want a public war. All of that is true. Exactly. I understood. The best lie Kimberly had told so far had been built from true pieces. Maybe mine did not need to be a lie at all. What do I give her? Nothing she isn't already entitled to. Meaning? You stop publicly challenging the prospective North Star partnership. I pushed away from the car. Denise. Listen. I did. If Kimberly believes she has beaten you emotionally, she will want to turn that victory into paperwork. A cold little current moved through my stomach. She'll formalize the story. If institutional credit is what she wants. It is. Then let her ask for it. I looked through the garage at rows of windshields reflecting fluorescent light. For 15 years, Kimberly had benefited from ambiguity. She had been absent, but she cared. She did not call, but she watched. She did not raise Owen, but perhaps she influenced him. Every claim could stretch because no one had ever forced it into a box with dates and sources. What if she asks me to sign the family statement? Say, you'll consider something narrow if the institutional review verifies the factual claims and Owen separately consents. I laughed without humor. She'll hear surrender. That's the idea. Owen listened before I called her. He cared about one thing. We could not invent a special standard just to catch Kimberly. If Northbridge reviewed North Star, it had to be the same kind of verification any storytelling partner should survive. And the 2 things his mother really had done had to remain true. I agreed. You sure? I asked. No, he said. But okay. I called Kimberly the next morning. Before dialing, I stood in my kitchen with one hand flat on the counter and practiced sounding exactly how I felt. Not triumphant, not dangerous. Tired. That part required no acting. She answered on the first ring. Laura. I've been thinking. Silence. Then softer. Okay. I could almost see her settling back somewhere expensive. I don't want this going on for months. Neither do I. It's hurting Owen. I've been saying that. I let that pass. This was the first test. Every muscle in my jaw wanted to correct her. I did not. I looked at the documentation again, I said. Another pause. And the 2 interventions are real. Her breathing changed. Barely. But I heard the satisfaction. Yes. I'm not going to deny them. Thank you. I closed my eyes. Thank you. As if she had been waiting for a dishonest person to finally become reasonable. I also don't want to keep publicly fighting about the North Star partnership. This time, she did not hide her relief. I'm glad you're seeing the bigger picture. My fingers curled against the counter. Maybe. Laura, this is the first sensible conversation we've had since this started. I bit the inside of my cheek. There were several possible responses. None would help. So I said, I'm tired. Her voice softened in a way that almost sounded maternal. I know. No, I thought. You know updates. But I stayed quiet, Kimberly continued. We don't have to agree about the past to stop damaging the present. That sentence was so polished I wondered if Celeste had written it for her. What do you want from me? She asked. The same thing I wanted before. Accuracy. A small edge returned to her voice. Meaning? If North Star's claims survive Northbridge's normal review, and if Owen consents to how his story is used, I'll consider signing a narrowly factual clarification. She went silent. I could feel the gears moving. What does narrowly factual mean? It means I won't sign that you raised him from a distance. I won't sign that North Star supported him if North Star didn't, but I'm willing to acknowledge that you remained informed and that you facilitated two real opportunities. Kimberly exhaled. You have no idea how much easier this could have been if you'd said that from the beginning. I almost laughed. Instead, I asked, will North Star submit the claims for review? Of course. Good. And you'll stop talking to reporters? I already stopped. Denise? What about her? Are you taking advice from her? I looked at the refrigerator. A note from Owen was still stuck under a magnet from the week before. Buy food that did not once have a delivery driver. I'm taking advice from several people. That woman has an agenda. So does everybody in this. Kimberly's tone sharpened, but only briefly. Then she chose victory. I knew you'd eventually be reasonable. I stared at the wall. For 45 years, no sentence had made me want to throw a phone more. I breathed once, then twice. I have a meeting, I said. We'll send revised language. Fine. I ended the call. Owen was sitting at my kitchen table because he had insisted on being present without being on speaker. He had heard only my half. The moment I set my phone down, he looked at it. Then at me. How? How what? How did you not throw that? I flexed my fingers. It was expensive. He stared at me for 1 second. Then he laughed. The laugh came out unexpectedly loud. Mine followed it. For maybe 10 seconds, we sat there laughing like two people who had not spent the last month being dissected by strangers. Then Owen wiped one hand over his face. She bought it? I think so. What did she say? I'm reasonable now. That's devastating. I may never recover. His smile faded. What happens next? That was the part that mattered. The next day, Denise introduced us to Mara Feldman, outside counsel, who had previously advised Northbridge on youth data and nonprofit partnership standards, and Ethan Cole from University Partnerships. Mara opened with the boundary that made the process credible. We are not here to adjudicate your family. Whether Kimberly had been a good or bad mother was not an institutional question. What North Star wanted Northbridge to say was, North Star sought a formal public engagement role tied to the research initiative, and its campaign relied heavily on Owen's personal history. Northbridge therefore needed ordinary partner verification. What support occurred, when, through whom, whether it was private or programmatic, who owned the images, and whether the adult subject consented. Owen asked if the same framework would apply to any partner. Mara said yes. Some tension left his shoulders. The claims matrix was far less dramatic than revenge, and far more useful. Dates, sources, rights, program attribution, consent. Owen glanced at it and whispered, You really did turn my research into family court. I told him not to insult his research. Mara's eyebrow rose. Neither of us elaborated. The important point was simple. Kimberly had asked to walk through an institutional door, and the door had ordinary rules. Meanwhile, Kimberly was publicly promoting North Star's new ethical storytelling and consent policy as proof that organizations should examine their own practices. When she announced that North Star would become the most consent-forward youth storytelling organization in the country, Owen paused the clip. Did she just volunteer for review under her own policy? Yes. Kimberly then agreed in writing that the new standard could apply to North Star's flagship stories, including Owen's. Her pride was doing the work for us. Patricia became the next problem, not because she refused, because she cried. Owen asked her to meet us at my house on Sunday afternoon. She arrived carrying a pie. I stared at it. Why did you bring pie? I didn't know what else to bring. Owen looked at the box. What kind? Apple. He nodded. Acceptable. Patricia almost smiled. The room softened for half a second. Then we sat down. Dad came too, but stayed mostly quiet. Owen explained the document review himself. No one was asking Patricia to hand me her password. No one wanted me digging through her inbox. If the independent reviewers later needed records from her correspondence with Kimberly, Patricia could export specific threads or the full relevant archive herself, preserve the originals, and authenticate them. Patricia's fingers tightened around a tissue. "You're going to show strangers everything I wrote." "Not everything," Owen said. "What if something is embarrassing?" He looked at her. "Grandma." She dropped her gaze. "I know." "No, I don't think you do." His voice remained calm. "That's the problem. Everybody keeps deciding embarrassment is more dangerous than what happened." Patricia's mouth trembled. Dad reached toward her, then stopped. Owen continued. "I'm not asking you to publish my childhood. I'm asking you not to destroy or edit the record, because you're afraid of what it says." "I wouldn't." He waited. Patricia closed her eyes. "No," she said finally. "I won't." "Will you preserve it?" "Yes." "And if independent counsel asks for authenticated copies?" She nodded. "Yes." Owen leaned back. The conversation was over for him. For Patricia, it was just beginning. She looked at me. "Is this what you wanted?" The question had enough hurt in it to make my old instincts wake up. I almost said no, almost comforted her. Instead, I answered carefully. I wanted Kimberly to stop rewriting his life. "And if this destroys her?" I felt Dad shift beside her. Owen answered before I could. "If the truth destroys the story, Grandma, then the story was the problem." Patricia looked at him. Something in her face broke. Not dramatically, just a small collapse around the mouth. She nodded once. Then she opened the pie. "We ate it because families are strange that way. You can discuss 15 years of betrayal and still argue over whether vanilla ice cream belongs on warm apple pie." Dad said yes. Patricia said it ruined the crust. Owen took 2 scoops. I watched him eat and thought about how much life existed outside the scandal. That mattered. Over the next 2 weeks, North Star assembled what it proudly called the complete Owen provenance file. Patricia's updates, Malcolm's family, office correspondence, the coding program record, and the Ortiz introduction. Kimberly called often enough for me to hear how certain she was becoming. Every document she found felt to her like vindication. To me, each one narrowed the room available for interpretation. North Star's annual Boston Gala fell on the second Friday in November. It was already a fundraiser and scheduled board governance event, and this year, Kimberly planned to unveil the ethics policy and announce the intended Northbridge partnership. Every formal communication still said pending final review. Kimberly spoke as if pending were decorative. Mara later confirmed that North Star had submitted its package, that the review had found discrepancies, and that the gala would proceed because the board session was already on the calendar. Kimberly had been told in writing that no partnership was final. The next evening, Denise said the anonymous source wanted to meet. We agreed on a private hotel conference room near the harbor. Owen came because the story was his. The room contained nothing cinematic beige carpet, bottled water, and fluorescent lighting harsh enough to make innocence look suspicious. A knock came. Denise opened the door, and the man outside took me a second to recognize from charity photographs and magazine profiles. Malcolm Price, the man Kimberly had left with 15 years earlier. Malcolm Price. Every muscle in my body tightened. Owen stopped moving. Malcolm looked at him first, not at me. His face changed in a way I did not expect. Shame. Real shame. "Hello, Owen." Owen's voice went cold. "Are you the anonymous source?" Malcolm nodded. "Yes." Denise closed the door. Nobody offered to shake hands. Malcolm sat across from us and placed a slim laptop on the table. "I owe you an explanation." Owen leaned back. "You owe me several." Malcolm accepted that without flinching. Malcolm said he had believed Kimberly's version, that the guardianship had become a mutually accepted kinship arrangement, and that I wanted direct contact limited because it would destabilize Owen. After Owen's television interview flatly contradicted that story, Malcolm had gone back through 15 years of correspondence instead of relying on Kimberly's summaries. "I never said that," I told him. "I know that now." Owen's answer was colder. "And you believed her for 15 years. Malcolm did not defend himself. Yes. Owen made him account for the 2 hidden interventions. Malcolm confirmed that he had helped flag the coding program application and later routed Owen's work toward the contact who introduced him to Dr. Ortiz. Nothing else. Exactly 2. Kimberly had asked Malcolm to use his network only when she thought an opportunity might materially change Owen's trajectory. Direct emotional contact, Malcolm had been told, was the one thing I supposedly did not want. He had never verified that with me, the court, or Owen. "So you asked the one person whose version benefited from your silence?" Malcolm lowered his eyes. "Yes." The messages were originals from Malcolm's personal account and family office archive, with records counsel could authenticate. He had not brought us a screenshot-shaped miracle. He had brought a chain another professional could verify. Denise moved closer. Malcolm opened a folder. The first message was from Kimberly in 2012. "Laura thinks direct contact will confuse him. She wants consistency. I hate it, but she's probably right." I felt my fingernails press into my palm. A second message from years later. "Mom keeps me updated. Owen is doing well. Laura handles the emotional part better than I ever could." Owen read without blinking. Malcolm scrolled, then stopped. "This is the one that made me contact Denise." The date was November 2011. I recognized it instantly. The same week Patricia had emailed Kimberly about the backpack. Malcolm had written, "Patty sounds worried. Do you want to call him? We can arrange it from here, if you don't want to speak to Laura." Kimberly's reply was underneath. "Don't call him for me. He has to stop waiting eventually." The old backpack sentence appeared again in Malcolm's archive, but this copy added something Patricia's thread had not shown us. Malcolm had offered to arrange a call without involving me. Kimberly had still answered, "Don't call him for me. He has to stop waiting eventually." There had been no Laura barrier, no conflict to navigate, just a phone call she chose not to make. Owen's breathing became shallow. Malcolm spoke quietly. "I believed she was honoring a boundary you created." He looked at me. "She wasn't. No." His voice lowered. "I know." He opened another message. The date was 2020, shortly before the coding program referral. Patricia had apparently sent Kimberly one of Owen's project links. Kimberly forwarded it to Malcolm. "He has real ability. This is the kind of moment that matters." Malcolm had responded, "Do you want to reach out to him yourself?" Kimberly, "No. That changes the emotional equation." Then another line. "Laura can handle the emotional part. I only need to step in when it changes the trajectory." The words blurred. For a moment, all I could hear was blood rushing in my ears. Owen did not move. Malcolm closed his eyes. "I thought that meant she was respecting your arrangement." I stared at the screen. "She made me the emotional landfill." My voice came out thin. Malcolm looked at me. I pointed at the message. She could watch him cry, watch him grow up, let Mom send her every milestone, and when something useful appeared, she moved a piece. Nobody answered. Because there was nothing to say. Owen leaned toward the laptop. His face had gone pale, but his voice was steady. "She didn't stay away, because she thought I didn't need her." Malcolm swallowed. "No, she stayed away because she thought needing her was bad for me." Malcolm looked at him. "I believe that is what she convinced herself." Owen stared at the final line again. "I only need to step in when it changes the trajectory." Then he looked at me. And for the first time since Kimberly came back, there was no confusion in his face. Only pain. The kind that arrives when the last comforting explanation finally dies. Kimberly had not merely watched him from a distance. She had designed a rule for when he was worth touching. Not when he was lonely. Not when he was sick. Not when he waited beside the door. Only when touching his life might change where it was going. The morning after Malcolm's disclosure, the messages moved out of family memory and into a clean evidence chain. Mara received the originals from Malcolm's own account and family office archive. 2 days later, Patricia came to Northbridge and personally authorized export of the relevant threads from her account, while an outside consultant explained what would be copied and preserved. I never received her password. I did not search the archive again. My own contribution was limited to photographs and documents I actually owned, while Owen controlled consent over his adult story. When Patricia finished, she looked at Owen and said, "I'm sorry." He did not rush to make her feel better. He nodded once. "I know. It was neither forgiveness nor punishment, and for the moment it was enough. Now we have clean sources," Mara said after my parents left. That sentence loosened something in me. North Star had submitted its own claims. Malcolm and Patricia had authenticated their own records, and nothing depended on a furious sister carrying stolen evidence into a room. The review could finally separate 3 different things Kimberly kept blending together: what she had done privately, what North Star had actually done as an organization, and what Owen had consented to let either of them say. North Star existed during the years of both referrals, but the records showed that neither referral had been delivered through a North Star program. Mara called me Wednesday evening. "We've completed the preliminary claims matrix." I sat at my kitchen table. "Can I see it?" "Yes. But understand something first." I straightened. "This is not a verdict on Kimberly as a parent." "I know." "It is not a moral ruling." "I know." "It is a review of claims North Star wants to make institutionally." "I know." She paused. "I say this because you may be disappointed by some of the classifications." My fingers curled around the edge of the table. "Meaning?" "2 interventions are verified." "I expected that. Long-term maternal mentorship is not." My chest tightened. "Organizational program support?" "Not verified." "Image rights?" "Incomplete." "Owen's consent?" "Not granted." I closed my eyes. Not dramatic. Not satisfying in the way revenge stories make satisfaction look. No guilty stamp. No sirens. Just categories. But categories were enough, Mara continued. The 2011 family placement language is more complicated. How? Kimberly's proposed materials describe a mutually understood family strategy. Patricia's and Malcolm's records do not support that. I thought of the email, "Laura will never let him fall. She doesn't know how. So it's false." I would call it unsupported and materially misleading if used as North Star's institutional history. I almost laughed. "That's lawyer for false. That is exactly why I don't use your version." "Despite everything," I smiled. Then she said, "The board has all of this." My smile disappeared. Shrine. Still happening. I sat up. "Why?" "Because the gala is not only the partnership announcement, it's North Star's annual fundraiser, board governance event, and the planned launch of its new ethics policy. And Kimberly still intends to announce the partnership. She intends to." The wording chilled me. Northbridge has told her it is pending? In writing. Twice. So if she presents it as final, that will be her choice. I looked toward the dark window over my sink. Does she know there are discrepancies? She knows the review is unresolved. But not the findings. Correct. That bothered me. Isn't that a trap? Mara's answer came immediately. No. A trap would be telling her she has approval and surprising her publicly. We have done the opposite. She has been told not to characterize the partnership as final until review is complete. I breathed out. The distinction mattered. Nobody was manufacturing her mistake. We were simply no longer preventing it. The gala was Friday night at a hotel overlooking Boston Harbor. At 4:30, a garment bag arrived at my office. I stared at it for 30 seconds before checking the card. Courtesy of North Star Futures Foundation. Inside was a cream-colored dress with a tag that made my monthly electric bill look emotionally affordable. A note from Celeste said they would be happy to provide hair and makeup before family photography. I took a picture and sent it to Owen. His reply came immediately. "Wear the overalls." I typed, "I don't own overalls." He wrote, "Coward." I sent the dress back. At 6:15, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror wearing a navy dress I had owned for 4 years. It fit. That was the only strategic value I required. I put on small earrings, low heels, and enough concealer to hide the fact that sleep had become an unreliable acquaintance. My hands were steady until I reached for my purse. Then they began to shake. I stood still, breathed, waited. The physical fear did not make sense if I looked at the evening rationally. I was not going to testify. I was not being sued. No one could take Owen away. He was 20. No court was deciding whether I had been a good enough guardian. Yet my body remembered Kimberly as danger in a way my adult mind still struggled to undo. Not because she had ever hit me, because she had always been able to make the room turn around her. She could create the crisis, and somehow everyone ended up asking whether I had responded too harshly. I put my hand on the doorknob. "You are not responsible for the room," I told my reflection. Then I left. The ballroom glittered in that expensive, careful way charity events always did. Glass walls looked out over the black harbor. White flowers sat in low arrangements, so donors could see each other across the tables. Waiters moved through the room carrying champagne. Screens along the walls played North Star videos of teenagers building robots, painting murals, launching tiny businesses, smiling beside adults who knew exactly where to stand for a camera. I checked in. The young woman at the table looked at my name and smiled too brightly. "Oh, Miss Bennett." I knew that tone. Recognition followed by immediate panic over whether recognition should be acknowledged. "That's me. Welcome." She handed me a place card. Table 12. Not Kimberly's. I almost thanked God. Owen arrived 10 minutes later in a dark suit that made him look older until he opened his mouth. "You look normal." I stared at him. "Thank you?" "I expected battle armor. This dress has pockets." He looked genuinely impressed. Then I withdraw my criticism. I touched his sleeve. "You okay?" "No." "Good." He frowned. "Good? I'd be concerned if this felt normal." He exhaled. "Fair." He wore a Northbridge badge under his jacket. Not son, not family. Undergraduate research fellow. I loved that more than I could explain. Patricia and Dad entered together. Mom wore dark blue. Dad wore the same suit he had worn to Owen's high school graduation, though he had lost enough weight that the shoulders sat differently now. Patricia approached us carefully. "Hi." "Hi, Grandma," Owen said. She looked relieved by the fact that he had answered. Then a North Star photographer appeared. "Wonderful. Can I get the family together near the backdrop?" Patricia froze. Dad said, "No." The photographer blinked. "We're just trying to get—" "No." Dad's voice was not loud. It did not need to be. He took Patricia's elbow and guided her toward their table. I watched them go. Owen leaned toward me. "Grandpa discovered boundaries at 71. Late bloomer. Still counts." A laugh escaped me. Then I saw Kimberly. She stood near the stage surrounded by donors. Her dress was silver gray. Her hair was swept back. One hand rested lightly on a man's forearm while she spoke, and everyone around her leaned in as though proximity itself were a privilege. Malcolm was nowhere near her. I found him at a table on the opposite side of the ballroom with 2 older men I recognized from business magazines. Separate table, separate conversation, separate life, At least for tonight. Kimberly saw us. Her expression brightened. She came over. You came? I almost said. You invited me. Instead, I nodded. She looked at my dress. You didn't use Celeste's stylist. No. A tiny pause. You look nice. Thank you. Her gaze shifted to Owen. You do too. Thanks. You're still comfortable with the research remarks tonight? Owen's face went still. What research remarks? Kimberly blinked. The short presentation. About provenance. Nobody asked me to present. She looked toward Celeste. Celeste suddenly found a donor across the room fascinating. Kimberly recovered. Well, perhaps there was a communication error. Apparently. I felt the old current in the room, Kimberly making an assumption. Everyone else expected to bend until the assumption became true. Owen did not. I'm here as a guest, he said. That's it. Kimberly smiled. Of course. Then she turned to me. I'm glad we've gotten to a better place. I looked at her. For a second, I wondered whether she truly believed that. Probably. Kimberly had always mistaken the absence of resistance for agreement. Before I could answer, a donor approached her. A woman with silver hair and a necklace the size of a mortgage smiled at me. You must be Laura. I am. She touched my arm. How wonderful that Kimberly was able to bring the whole family together. I looked around. Dad and Patricia were sitting 3 tables away. Malcolm was across the ballroom. Owen was already stepping back toward the Northbridge group. I felt laughter climb into my throat. I swallowed most of it. Yes, I said. Very together. The donor beamed. Kimberly's eyes flicked toward me. I kept my face straight. Dinner began. I barely tasted it. The first speaker was Northstar's board chair, Evelyn Shaw, a retired hospital executive with the calm voice of someone who had spent decades sitting in rooms where everyone else wanted something. She thanked donors, praised student programs, talked about accountability. Then she introduced Kimberly. Applause filled the ballroom. My palms dampened instantly. Kimberly walked onto the stage. She was excellent. That was important. People like Kimberly did not keep control because they were stupid. She knew how to make a room feel as if it had been invited into a private truth. She talked about changing standards in philanthropy, about young people deserving control over their own stories, about organizations refusing to turn pain into marketing material. I watched Owen. His face did not move. Kimberly said, If we expect transparency from the young innovators we support, then we must demand it from ourselves. Applause. Something cold crawled over my skin. She was standing 10 yards away, describing the exact standard that could dismantle her, and she looked proud of it. Then the screen behind her displayed the title, Northstar Ethical Storytelling and Consent Policy. Kimberly explained that the new policy required accurate attribution, ongoing consent, documented sources, and clear separation between an individual's life story and an institution's role in it. I almost turned to Owen. I stopped myself. He already knew. Everyone at our table knew. The only person who did not appear to understand the irony was the woman saying the words. Kimberly finished to strong applause. Evelyn Shaw returned to the stage. Thank you, Kimberly. They shook hands. Evelyn did not leave. That was the first sign. Kimberly turned slightly, expecting the next segment. Instead, Evelyn said, As part of tonight's governance program, we're also formalizing Northstar's application of these standards to our own partnership materials. The room quieted. Not much. A subtle shift. I felt my heartbeat jump. Kimberly smiled. Absolutely. Evelyn looked toward a small table near the stage where Mara sat with 2 Northstar board members and another attorney. The proposed Northbridge partnership remains under final review. There it was, plain, public, pending. Kimberly could not later say she had been misled. Evelyn continued. Because the proposed campaign includes impact claims associated with Owen Bennett's personal and professional development, the board has asked that those claims be certified before any partnership announcement moves forward. A staff member approached the stage carrying a thin folder. My mouth went dry. Kimberly looked at the folder. For 1 second, her smile disappeared. Then it returned. Evelyn said, "Kimberly, Council has advised that final review remains open. We can postpone this portion, if you'd prefer additional time." There, the exit, clean, public, available. All Kimberly had to do was take it. I could almost hear Denise's voice. Let her choose. Kimberly glanced toward the board table, then toward the donors. Hundreds of people who had just applauded her for accountability. A large screen behind her still displayed the words, ethical storytelling and consent. Her pride had built the room. Now it locked the door. Kimberly smiled. There's no need to postpone. My fingers went numb. Owen shifted beside me. Evelyn asked, "You're comfortable certifying the materials submitted by North Star as complete and accurate to the best of your knowledge?" "Yes." "And the factual claims concerning North Star's role and your stated relationship to Owen?" "Yes." "And you understand that any material discrepancies must be addressed before the partnership can be approved?" "Of course." A pen was handed to her. I heard my own pulse. She signed. Not with hesitation. With flourish. The same confidence she had carried onto national television. The same confidence she had used when she told me I only understood motherhood as labor. The same confidence behind you kept him safe. I made him hungry. For 1 terrible second, I almost wanted to stop her. That was how deeply my old instincts ran. Even now, I saw the cliff. Even now, some part of me wanted to warn my sister not to step off it. I wrapped both hands around my water glass. Do not fix it. Kimberly handed the folder back. Applause started. Light, polite. Evelyn lifted one hand. Before we proceed, Independent Counsel has completed the preliminary provenance review. The applause died. Kimberly turned. This time, her smile did not fully return. Mara stood. She did not walk onto the stage. She spoke from the board table. This review does not address private family relationships. It addresses only the claims proposed for North Star institutional use. My breathing slowed, exactly as promised. No backpack email. No 5-year-old's pain projected for entertainment. No private humiliation. Mara continued. Several claims have been verified, several have not. Kimberly's shoulders stiffened. The screen behind the stage changed. Not to an email. Not to a photograph. To a plain white slide. Provenance Review Partnership Status. The room became silent. 4 lines appeared. 2 individual referrals verified. Sustained mentorship, not verified. North Star Program support, not verified. Adult subject consent not granted. I heard somebody at another table inhale sharply. Kimberly did not move. Then another line appeared. IMAGE rights incomplete. And beneath it, partnership status. Paused pending material attribution and consent corrections. The color drained from Kimberly's face. Not all at once. Slowly. Like somebody lowering the light behind her skin. She looked toward Mara. Then Evelyn. Then Owen. Finally, her eyes found me. Across the crowded ballroom, the sound seemed to fall away. For 15 years, Kimberly had controlled meaning by keeping every fact soft enough to reshape. Now, behind her, each claim sat in a box. Verified. Not verified. Consent granted. Consent not granted. No adjectives could move them. No family history could blur them. No motherly smile could make 2 introductions become 15 years of parenting. Kimberly stared at me. I lifted my champagne glass a fraction of an inch. Not a toast, not victory, just acknowledgement. 3. The next slide loaded. 2. Kimberly's mouth opened. 1. And for the first time since my sister had returned, the story behind her began to change without her permission. The ballroom went so quiet I could hear ice settle in my water glass. Behind Kimberly, the review summary remained on the screen. 2 private referrals verified, sustained mentorship, and North Star program support not verified. Adult consent not granted. Image rights incomplete. Partnership paused. Mara and Evelyn did not look at me. That steadied me. This was not my presentation or Owen's revenge. North Star had asked to attach institutional claims to a university initiative, and the board was reporting which of those claims survived review. Evelyn clarified that the 2 referrals belonged to Kimberly privately, not to a North Star program, and that the foundation could not represent 15 years of mentorship it could not substantiate. Owen's childhood abandonment and current research identity could not become fundraising material without his consent. No private backpack email appeared on the screen. No 5-year-old's pain was projected for applause. The board disclosed only what governance required. I looked at Owen. His face was pale, but his shoulders had changed. The facts were finally smaller than the myth built around them. Kimberly stepped toward Evelyn. I think some context is missing. Her voice carried farther than she intended because her microphone was still live. Several heads turned. Evelyn did not flinch. You'll have an opportunity to respond. I'd like to respond now. Kimberly did what she always did when a definition stopped serving her. She tried to widen it. She said family relationships could not be reduced to boxes, and that unconventional support was still support. It was a good sentence, which was precisely why it had worked for so long. Kimberly continued. My son's life was complicated. I made choices that were unconventional and, yes, painful. But the fact that my support did not fit a traditional model does not mean it did not exist. My stomach tightened. Her son, still. She gestured toward the screen. 2 interventions are verified. Those interventions happened because I followed his development closely. They happened because I knew when an opportunity mattered. She looked toward Owen. The whole room followed. My muscles went rigid. Owen knows those opportunities changed his trajectory. I felt him shift beside me. I leaned toward him. You don't have to. I know. His voice was quiet. Then he stood. My hand closed around the edge of the table. He did not look at me. He looked toward Evelyn. May I say something? Evelyn hesitated, then nodded. A staff member brought him a wireless microphone. Owen took it with both hands. For a second, I saw his thumb rub the side of his index finger, the old nervous habit. Then he looked at Kimberly. The 2 referrals are real. The room changed. Kimberly's face softened instantly, almost triumphantly. Owen continued. My mother asked someone to flag my application to a coding program when I was 14. I got a second look. I still had to be admitted on my work, but the second look mattered. He swallowed. At 17, she helped route my work to someone who eventually connected me to Dr. Ortiz. That introduction mattered too. Kimberly's chin lifted. I felt something cold crawl under my ribs. Owen did not stop. I'm grateful those things happened. His voice was steady now. And I'm not going to pretend they didn't happen just because I'm angry about everything else. Kimberly smiled. Then Owen said, But gratitude is not ownership. Her smile froze. The room went very still. I can be grateful for 2 doors someone opened and still tell the truth about the 15 years between them. He looked toward the board. North Star did not admit me to that program. North Star did not mentor me. North Star did not build my research career. And I never agreed to have the worst part of my childhood turned into evidence that a resilience strategy worked. A pressure built behind my eyes. Owen looked at Kimberly again. You helped twice. There was no cruelty in Owen's answer, and that made it stronger. He was not asking the room to hate Kimberly. He was correcting the scale of her claim. Kimberly took 1 step toward Owen. You know that's not what I'm saying. He held the microphone at his side. I know exactly what you're saying. No, you don't. You're hearing this through Laura. My skin went hot. There it was, the oldest exit. If Owen disagreed with her, I must have planted the disagreement. Kimberly looked toward the room. For years, I was told that direct contact would destabilize him. I respected that. I stayed informed because I cared, but I was asked not to interfere emotionally. Malcolm stood. He did not ask permission. He simply stood from his table, and the movement drew attention, because almost everyone in the room knew who he was. Kimberly saw him. Something in her face broke before he said a word. Malcolm's voice was low, but the room was quiet enough to carry it. You told me Laura asked for no contact. Kimberly stared at him. He continued. She did not. A murmur moved through the ballroom. Kimberly's hand tightened around the microphone. Malcolm, this is not the place. You made it the place. His face was tired, not angry. That made the words land harder. You told me the guardianship arrangement included a family agreement that direct contact would harm Owen. I believed you. I helped with 2 introductions because I believed I was respecting that arrangement. Kimberly's eyes flashed. We discussed this privately. Yes. And you're taking fragments out of context. No. He looked toward Evelyn. I provided counsel with the full original threads. Kimberly's shoulders stiffened. The complete threads show I repeatedly offered to help arrange contact. Kimberly declined. No one spoke. I heard Patricia inhale behind me. Kimberly turned toward her mother. Mom. One word. Not a question. A command disguised as a plea. Patricia's face crumpled. I knew exactly what Kimberly wanted. Say Laura made it difficult. Say the family believed distance was best. Say everyone agreed. Give her one sentence soft enough to build a new story around. Patricia stood. Her hands were shaking. For a terrible second, I thought she would do what she had always done. Balance the room. Protect the most volatile person. Ask the rest of us to absorb the difference. Kimberly said, You know how complicated it was. Patricia's mouth opened, closed. Then she said, Laura did not tell you to stay away. My lungs emptied. Kimberly stared at her. Patricia's voice trembled, but she kept going. I kept you informed because I thought it would help you come back someday. That was my decision. Laura did not ask me to do it. Mom? No. I had never heard Patricia say that word to Kimberly with that tone. She looked smaller than my sister. Older. But for once, she did not look away. I should have stopped giving you private parts of his life when you were not willing to be part of the hard parts. Kimberly's jaw tightened. You're doing this because Laura has turned everyone against me. Patricia shook her head. No, I'm doing it because I kept trying to make sure nobody had to feel the full consequence of anything. Her eyes filled. And that hurt him. Owen looked down. Dad reached for Patricia's hand. She let him take it. Kimberly turned away, as if the sight offended her. I felt no triumph. Only exhaustion so deep it seemed to reach my bones. The family machine had stopped. That was all. No one was volunteering to carry her weight. Evelyn stepped back to the microphone. I think we need to return to the governance matter. Kimberly laughed once. Sharp. Governance. Evelyn's expression did not change. Yes. That one word was almost comically effective. Kimberly looked around the room. At least be honest about what this is. This is a family dispute being weaponized through policy. Mara answered from the board table. The review would not exist if North Star had not proposed institutional claims based on the family story. You're splitting hairs. We are distinguishing private acts from charitable program activity. Same difference. No. Mara's voice remained calm. It is the difference donors are entitled to understand. That distinction changed the room. The question was no longer whether Kimberly deserved forgiveness. It was whether North Star had solicited trust or money using claims about services the organization itself had not provided. Evelyn opened the folder in front of her. The board met earlier today after receiving the preliminary review. Kimberly went still. Evelyn continued. Effective immediately, the proposed Northbridge partnership is suspended, pending corrective review. A soft murmur moved through the room. North Star will remove the Owen Bennett case study and associated disputed childhood materials from active fundraising and promotional use. Kimberly's lips parted. The board is also commissioning an independent review of other youth impact stories developed under current leadership to confirm consent, attribution, and program involvement. The review would also examine other youth stories developed under current leadership for consent and accurate program attribution. If those files were clean, nothing further would follow. If they were not, North Star now had a duty to correct them. Kimberly was placed on administrative leave during that review. There were no criminal theatrics, only the kind of consequence her public role actually supported. Kimberly finally said, "You can't suspend me over incomplete findings." Evelyn replied, "This is administrative leave during review, not a final disciplinary finding. I built this foundation's public identity. No one disputes your role. Then you understand what this will do?" Yes. The answer was almost gentle. Kimberly stared at her. Evelyn continued. Several major donors have already asked that commitments connected to the proposed campaign be paused until attribution questions are resolved. Council will determine whether any fundraising materials require correction and whether any funds tied to materially inaccurate representations require restitution or other action. Major donors had already paused commitments connected to the proposed campaign, while Council determined whether corrections or restitution were required for any materially inaccurate fundraising. For Kimberly's particular pride, the punishment was painfully specific: an audit, corrections, and a permanent distinction between the story she had sold and the actions North Star could prove. She pointed toward Patricia. "You gave her the emails." Patricia flinched. Then Kimberly turned to Malcolm. "You've wanted out for months. Congratulations." Malcolm's expression tightened, but he did not answer. She looked toward the North Star staff. "And all of you just handed over whatever they asked for?" Evelyn cut in. But Kimberly had already started doing what people do when blame can no longer be pushed in one direction. She scattered it. "This foundation exists because I made donors care." No one replied. "I took stories nobody wanted to hear and made people understand them." The sentence hit me harder than she knew. Stories nobody wanted to hear, made people understand them. That was the entire problem. Kimberly believed stories became hers when she improved the packaging. Evelyn said quietly, "That is exactly why the review is necessary." Kimberly looked at her. For once, there was no answer. The formal program ended early, not dramatically. No one escorted Kimberly out. No police entered. The band never started. Donors clustered into small circles. Board members disappeared into a private room. Staff began quietly removing printed materials from tables because Owen's case study appeared on some of them. I watched one young employee slide a glossy brochure into a cardboard box. On the cover was a photograph of Owen at 17. Under it, "Resilience by Design." My stomach turned. Owen saw it too. He looked away. "Ready?" I asked. "Almost." Mara approached us carrying a folder. "If you're comfortable, now is the right time to formalize the consent position." Owen nodded. We moved into a smaller meeting room off the ballroom. No champagne, no white flowers. Just a long table, 6 chairs, a legal pad, and somebody's abandoned cup of coffee. The contrast felt appropriate. Mara placed 2 documents in front of Owen. The first was a formal written notice, stating that he did not consent to North Star or Kimberly, using his name, image, childhood abandonment, family history, or research identity in fundraising or promotional storytelling, unless he later granted specific written permission. This doesn't erase things already lawfully published by independent media, Mara explained. And it doesn't control what your mother says privately about her life. It puts North Star on clear notice about organizational use. Owen read every page, slowly. I watched him underline one phrase with his finger. Adult subject consent. When he reached the signature line, he paused. Do I have to say why? No. Good. He signed. My chest tightened. There was something heartbreakingly ordinary about the motion. A pen moving across paper. 20 years old. Finally old enough to tell an institution that his childhood belonged to him. Mara turned to me. My documents were narrower. Copyright and licensing notices for photographs I had taken. A correction request for North Star's internal archive, clarifying that I was Owen's court-appointed guardian, not a temporary caregiver participating in Kimberly's long-term maternal plan. I read carefully. Nothing claimed I was his only mother. Nothing erased Kimberly's biology. Nothing tried to make history cleaner than it was. I signed. The pen felt heavy between my fingers. When we finished, Owen leaned back. That's it? Mara gathered the pages. For tonight. He looked almost disappointed. What were you expecting? I don't know. Thunder. Mara gave him the faintest smile. Most consequential paperwork happens under fluorescent lighting. That's depressing. It's also why it survives court challenges. I laughed quietly. So did Owen. The sound felt strange after the ballroom. But good. We stepped back into the corridor just before midnight. The gala had emptied. Staff rolled carts across the carpet. Someone was taking down the North Star backdrop. I saw Kimberly near the elevators. Alone. Kimberly stood near the elevators without the usual orbit of staff and donors. Same dress. Same perfect hair. But the room no longer arranged itself around her. Owen stopped. I felt him tense. Kimberly looked at him. For 1 second, something almost human crossed her face. Pain. Maybe regret. Then she looked at me, and it hardened into accusation. So that's it. I said nothing. You got what you wanted. No. My answer surprised her. She laughed bitterly. My board turned on me. Malcolm humiliated me. Mom handed over private correspondence. Donors are freezing commitments. And you're going to stand there pretending this wasn't revenge? I felt my pulse rise. Owen touched my arm, not to stop me, to remind me I had a choice. I breathed once. Your board asked you to prove what you wanted them to say. You set that up. I asked for the same review any partner should survive. You knew what they'd find. I knew what happened. Her face tightened. Same thing. No. I looked at her. For once, I did not need her agreement. Behind me, an elevator dinged. Owen stepped forward. I signed the consent notice. Kimberly's eyes moved to him. What notice? North Star can't use my story anymore. Her face changed. Owen. My name. Childhood photos where rights apply. The abandonment story. My research identity. None of it belongs in North Star fundraising unless I say yes. I'm your mother. He did not flinch. That does not make you my publicist. The elevator doors opened. He stepped inside. Kimberly looked at me. You're enjoying this. I searched myself before answering. There had been flashes of satisfaction along the way, but standing there I felt mostly tired. No, she shook her head. Liar. Maybe part of me enjoyed watching you finally have to answer a question instead of redefining it. Her eyes flashed. But this? I looked toward the folder in Mara's hands. This is not about hurting you. You think that makes it better? It makes it over. She stepped closer. We're sisters. Her voice cracked for the first time that night. Not the polished tremor she used on television. A real one. You can't erase that. I thought about how often sisters, family, be the bigger person, and think about Owen had functioned like bills only I was expected to pay. The strange lightness in my body came from finally declining the charge. I met her eyes. That's a fact. I pressed the elevator button. It isn't a contract. The doors opened again. I stepped inside beside Owen. Kimberly stayed where she was. For once, I did not explain. I did not soften the sentence. I did not reach out to keep the door from closing. And when the metal panels slid together between us, I let them. By the first snow warning, the story had stopped being breaking news. Strangers still argued online, but North Star's review moved behind closed doors. Kimberly remained out of active leadership. Disputed campaign materials were corrected or removed, and the Foundation tightened consent and attribution rules for future youth stories. Malcolm separated his family office from North Star and moved out of the marital home for an indefinite period. I did not ask what would happen to their marriage. Owen went back to the lab. The $20 million consortium kept moving because nothing about the science had changed. For a while, he still called some mornings to ask whether the coding program or Dr. Ortiz had changed everything. I kept giving him the least satisfying, honest answer. I don't know. Eventually, the questions came less often. He did not solve the counterfactual. He stopped believing he had to. 3 weeks after the gala, Dad called and asked if I could help them clean out the house. They were downsizing. That decision had been coming for years. The stairs bothered Patricia's knees. Dad hated shoveling the driveway. Half the upstairs bedrooms had become storage for things no one wanted enough to use, and no one felt guilty enough to throw away. Normally, downsizing would have meant 6 months of Patricia touching every object and saying, "Someone might need this." Apparently, public disgrace had not improved her relationship with old Tupperware. When I arrived Saturday morning, Dad was standing in the garage holding a box labeled cords. "What are those?" He looked inside. "No idea." "Then throw them away." "What if they go to something?" "What?" "That's the problem." I stared at him. He stared back. Then he shoved the box toward me. "You're the one with the organizational job. I manage biomedical operations. I do not identify 27 years of mystery chargers." "Same skill set." I carried the box toward the trash pile. Behind me, he said, "Don't actually throw it out." I kept walking. "Laura, I put it in the donation area instead. That counted as compromise." Inside, Patricia sorted old photographs into piles and looked tired in a new way, not sick, simply less determined to make everyone else comfortable. Owen answered some of her calls and had met her once for coffee, but trust had not returned to its old shape. Patricia did not complain to me about the distance. That restraint told me more than another apology would have. She pointed toward the hallway. "There are 3 boxes in the closet upstairs with your name on them." "My name?" "Your old things." "I took my things 20 years ago. No one takes all their things." "Normal people do." She almost smiled. "Go look." I climbed the stairs. The house felt smaller than it had when I was young. That always happens eventually. Rooms that once contained entire childhoods become 14 feet by 12 feet and badly placed electrical outlets. My old bedroom had been painted pale gray after I moved out. The floral wallpaper was gone. The desk where I studied for college entrance exams had become Dad's place for storing tax records. The closet held 3 cardboard boxes. One contained college notebooks. One held old Christmas ornaments. The third was labeled Owen, Laura Apt. My hand stopped on the lid. For a second, I heard nothing. Then the sounds of the house came back. A cabinet closing downstairs. Dad dragging something heavy through the garage. Patricia's radio playing softly in the kitchen. I sat on the floor. The cardboard had softened at the corners. Inside, were things I had not seen in years. A plastic dinosaur cup, a school folder with Owen M. printed in thick blue marker, a tiny raincoat, 2 picture books, 1 sneaker without its mate. I smiled despite myself. There are few things more useless than a single child's shoe, yet somehow parents keep them, as if the missing one may return after a decade and apologize. I moved the raincoat aside. Then I saw black fabric. My breath stopped. The backpack. The actual backpack. Not the repaired one Owen used now. I had forgotten we had replaced the original when the zipper finally failed. He had insisted on keeping it, and apparently Patricia had boxed it during one of our moves. I pulled it out. The fabric had faded to charcoal. One strap was frayed nearly through. The little plastic zipper pull had a bite mark on one edge, because Owen used to chew things when nervous. My hands started shaking. Not violently, a fine tremor in my fingertips. I sat with the bag on my knees. For 15 years, I had remembered the backpack as an image. Beside the door. Packed. Waiting. Memory had cleaned it up. The real thing was smaller. That hurt. It was a little boy's bag. A 5-year-old's bag. Not big enough for a life. Not even big enough for a full weekend. I opened the zipper. It stuck halfway. I pulled gently. Inside was a faded t-shirt rolled into a ball. 2 plastic cars, red and blue. A pair of socks. And at the bottom, crushed almost flat, a package of cheese crackers sealed inside cloudy plastic. I stared at it. My throat tightened so quickly I had to breathe through my nose. He had packed food. Of course he had. 5-year-old logic. If Mom came back, maybe they would drive far. Maybe she would not have snacks. Maybe he needed to be ready. My eyes burned. I touched the old package with one finger. A memory opened so sharply I could smell our apartment. Toast. Laundry soap. Dust from the radiator. Owen sitting cross-legged beside the door. So Mom doesn't have to wait when she comes back. I pressed my lips together. I had cried in the bathroom that day because I could not let him see what his hope did to me. Now, 15 years later, I sat in my parents' closet and finally cried where no child needed protecting. Not loudly. The tears simply came. For the boy, for the woman I had been, for the stupid crackers, for all the years I thought motherhood meant making sure nobody else had to feel the sharpest version of anything. A floorboard creaked behind me. I wiped my face. Patricia stood in the doorway. She saw the backpack. Her hand went to her mouth. Oh, I looked down. Yeah. She came in slowly and sat on the edge of the bed. For a minute she said nothing. Then she whispered, I forgot I kept that. So did I. Her eyes filled. I'm sorry. I let out a breath. We've done that part. No. She shook her head. Not this part. I waited. Patricia looked at the bag instead of me. When you were raising him, I kept telling myself I was protecting a relationship. Her voice shook. I thought if Kimberly still knew his grades, his interests, the funny things he said, then she wasn't completely gone. And if she wasn't completely gone, maybe one day she could come back without everything being broken. I said nothing. She swallowed. I gave her the parts of motherhood that were easiest to love. That sentence went through me, Patricia continued. The pictures, the achievements, the stories, the things he said when he was sweet or funny or brilliant. Her eyes dropped. And you got the fevers, the anger, the school calls, the nights he cried. I looked at her. She finally looked back. I gave Kimberly the feeling of knowing him, without making her do the work of knowing him. My chest tightened. For once, she was not asking me to make the confession easier. I thought I was keeping a door open, she said. I didn't understand that I was letting her stand outside the door and look in whenever she wanted. I ran my thumb over the backpack strap. Owen may not trust you again for a while. I know. He might never trust you the same way. Her face crumpled slightly. I know. I waited for the but. There was none. That mattered. Patricia stood. Before leaving, she touched the door frame. Do you want me to give you some time? Yes. She nodded. Then she left. I sat another 10 minutes. When I finally went downstairs, I carried the backpack with me. Dad saw it and immediately looked away. He knew. No explanation needed. I put it in the passenger seat of my car. I had just closed the door when another car pulled into the driveway. Silver Mercedes. My stomach tightened before Kimberly stepped out. Kimberly stepped out looking almost ordinary in a black coat. Hair tied back, no cameras or stage lights. Tiredness crossed her face, and for half a second my body mistook it for remorse. I was hoping you'd be here. She asked to talk inside. I refused. Then she said the sentence that could have summarized our entire adult relationship. I need a favor. A favor? Yes. What kind? North Star's board is trying to separate the family issue from the governance review. Good. They're not succeeding. That sounds like their problem. Kimberly wanted Owen to issue a statement saying she had made mistakes, but always loved him, and asking people to separate the family conflict from North Star's professional conduct. I understood immediately. This was not an apology. It was a firewall. She wanted Owen to help protect her standing with the board. When I said so, she warned that paused donors could hurt employees and programs. The old mechanism was intact. Put an innocent person between Kimberly and the consequence, then make refusal look cruel. If North Star's work is sound, the review should help it, I said. And if it isn't, that is not mine to fix. The sentence landed inside me, with more force than it did on her. For most of my life, I would have already been calculating who might be hurt, and how I could absorb enough damage to keep the room stable. This time, the problem stayed where it belonged. She tried family next. Mom was getting older. We had already lost Evan. I stopped her before she could turn Owen's dead father into another lever. After a silence, Kimberly asked, "You really hate me?" I realized anger would have been easier for both of us. No, I spent too many years arranging my life around your choices to spend the rest arranging my emotions around you too. Then what do you feel? Done. The word frightened her more than rage, because rage would still have connected us. Then Kimberly noticed the backpack on my passenger seat. I remember that bag. When she said she had been wrong about what it meant, hope rose in me for one foolish second. But she continued. The distance had still shaped Owen. Even now, she wanted the outcome to redeem the method. I did not deny that her choices had affected him. You opened 2 doors. You caused pain. Both things mattered, but influence is not ownership, and impact is not parenthood. She insisted that she was still his mother and had helped make him who he was. Opening 2 doors does not purchase the 15 years between them. Her face hardened, but mine no longer had to. Her face crumpled with anger. You always make yourself the martyr. I felt almost nothing. That was how I knew something had truly changed. I opened my car door. You asked for a favor. She stared at me. I'm not calling Owen, Laura. I'm not writing a statement. I'm not talking to your board. I'm not helping North Star. I'm not explaining you. I picked up the backpack. And whether Owen ever wants a relationship with you is his decision. You've poisoned him. No. I closed the car door. I stopped translating you. I walked toward the house. Behind me, Kimberly said, "You think you won?" I stopped, turned. She stood beside the Mercedes, arms crossed tightly over herself. I thought about the gala, the board, the review, the backpack, the little boy who once believed a snack and 2 toy cars were enough to follow his mother anywhere. No, I said. I think I finally stopped playing. Then I went inside. 2 weeks later, Northbridge held the formal public launch for the research initiative. The event was smaller than the first forum, and far less glamorous than North Star's gala. Researchers stood beside demonstration screens. Graduate students argued over cables. Somebody had ordered too much coffee and not enough food. It felt like Owen's world again, not Kimberly's. I arrived early and found him near the back of the auditorium arguing with a projector. You know there are people whose job is to fix that. They're wrong. The projector? The people. Good start. He looked over. You came? You invited me. You sometimes ignore invitations. Only bad ones. He wore a navy sweater and the same old sneakers he had owned since spring. On his badge, Owen Bennett Undergraduate Research Fellow. Nothing more. No miracle child. No abandoned genius. No son of anyone. Just his name and his work. The presentation began. Owen spoke for 7 minutes. No mention of Kimberly. No mention of North Star. No mention of the scandal. He talked about trust, about how systems that sound confident can still be wrong, about why people should be able to trace claims back to evidence. Then he said something I had heard before. Confidence means very little if you can't show where the answer came from. I smiled. Afterward, I found him near the coffee station. You stole that from me. He looked offended. You reduced my entire research field to one sentence, and improved it. That remains disputed. I held out the backpack, the old one. His face changed, slowly. Where did you find that? Grandma's house. He took it with both hands. For a while he did not speak. Then he opened it. He found the t-shirt, the socks, the 2 cars. When he picked up the crushed package of crackers, his mouth opened slightly. Oh. I watched his eyes move, not toward me, somewhere inward. I forgot the food. I didn't. That's disgusting. It's 15 years old. Why did Grandma keep this? Because our family has a pathological relationship with storage. He laughed softly. Then he held up the crackers. Can I throw these away? Yes. You sure they're not symbolic? They're mold. Strong symbolism. He walked to a trash can and dropped them in. Just like that. No ceremony. No speech. Old crackers hit plastic and disappeared. When he came back, he put the toy cars into his coat pocket. You keeping those? Yes. Why? They have resale value. They came from a drugstore in 2010. Vintage. I smiled. He looked at the backpack again. One strap was nearly broken. You know this thing won't survive another week. I told you that when you were 14. I was emotionally attached. You still are. Less so. He slipped one arm through the strap. It almost snapped. I laughed. You're going through airport security with that? I leave for Chicago Tuesday. For the lab trip? Yeah. That bag won't make it through TSA. He adjusted the strap. It survived this family. The laugh came out of me before I could stop it. Loud enough that 2 researchers turned around. Owen grinned. For a few seconds I could not speak. Because there it was, the same backpack, but not the same meaning. At 5, Owen had packed it because he was waiting for someone to come back and choose him. At 20, he put it over his shoulder because he had somewhere he had chosen to go. That difference was everything. I reached up and fixed the twisted strap. Old habit, he let me. Then he said, Mom? Yeah? Thank you. My throat tightened. For what? He looked toward the room behind us. People moving, talking, living, all of it. I shook my head. You don't owe me gratitude for raising you. I know. That's important. I know. Good. He smiled. You're making this difficult. I'm your mother. It's part of the maintenance. His face changed. He remembered. You kept him safe. I made him hungry. For a second, pain moved through both of us. Then Owen shook his head. No. What? You didn't just keep me safe. I waited. You made home boring enough that I could think about other things. I stared at him. That may be the worst compliment I've ever received. It's a strong one. Boring. In a good way. There is no good way. He laughed again. Then someone from the lab called his name. He turned. I have to go. Go. He took 3 steps, then looked back. The backpack hung crooked from one shoulder. For one brief second, I saw him at 5. Not because he looked like a child, because memory sometimes lays 2 versions of a person on top of each other. The boy who waited. The man who no longer did. Then he turned and disappeared into the crowd. I stood there a little longer. People like to believe family is proved in dramatic moments. When I thought about Owen's childhood, I remembered quieter evidence instead. Waffles cut into squares, permission slips, burned grilled cheese, principals' offices, nightmares survived beside a bed. Love had repeated itself in ordinary days, long before anyone applauded. Some of Owen's strength may have grown around the empty place Kimberly left. Pain shapes people. That never made the wound a gift, and he never needed to become brilliant, useful, or famous to deserve someone staying. He had been worth staying for before Northbridge, before the grant, before anyone knew his name. I had spent most of my life proving love by carrying what other people dropped: Kimberly's consequences, mom's guilt, family peace. Learning to put those things down did not make me cruel. It meant I finally understood which burdens were mine. The backpack belonged to Owen now, because he was free to carry it wherever he chose. For the first time in 15 years, when I pictured that bag beside a door, I did not see a child waiting for someone to return. I saw my son walking through the door himself,